A wealthy businessman crashed an elegant wedding, determined to stop a black bride from trapping his son into marriage. In the chaos that ensued, emergency DNA results arrived that silenced everyone. The bride was actually his daughter from a past relationship, making the wedding impossible for a completely different reason than his prejudice suggested. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel shimmered. Crystal chandeliers cast a dazzling light on the meticulously arranged floral displays, their perfume a heady mix of lilies and roses. Zara, breathtaking in her ivory gown, stood poised at the altar, a serene smile playing on her lips. Ethan, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, watched her. A mixture of adoration and apprehension etched on his face. He shifted nervously, his eyes darting towards the imposing figure of his father, Arthur, who loomed in the shadows near the entrance, his face a thundercloud of disapproval. Arthur, a titan of industry known as much for his ruthless business acumen as his deeply ingrained prejudices, felt a surge of incandescent rage. He hadn't come to witness this travesty, this blatant attempt by a gold digger to snare his son. The silk of his bespoke suit felt like a suffocating weight against his skin, mirroring the suffocating anger within. He clenched his jaw, the muscles in his neck corded with tension. This wedding, this woman, they were an affront to everything he believed in. The organ music swelled, a prelude to the vows. But before the officiant could begin, Arthur exploded into the scene. His voice, gravelly and powerful, cut through the expectant hush. "This wedding is stopped." The ballroom fell silent, every eye turning towards the furious businessman, his presence radiating a cold fury that chilled the very air. Zara's serene smile faltered, her eyes widening slightly, but her composure remained unbroken. Ethan, his face paling, took a step towards his father, his silent plea evident in the desperate hope in his eyes. The scent of lilies and roses now seemed to battle against the sharp tang of Arthur's simmering rage, filling the air with a potent mixture of expectation and utter dread. The silence following Arthur's outburst hung heavy, thick as the velvet curtains draping the ballroom windows. Zara, her composure a fragile mask, met his gaze, her eyes unwavering despite the tremor in her carefully controlled breathing. The scent of lilies, sharp and sweet, fought with the metallic tang of fear that permeated the air. Ethan, caught between the raging tempest of his father's anger and the quiet strength of his fiancée, felt his heart crack. This woman, Arthur sputtered, his voice laced with venom, is nothing but a gold digger. His eyes, narrowed slits of fury, scanned the room, seeking validation, finding only shocked silence. Zara's hand, perfectly manicured, tightened around the bouquet of lilies. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and steady, a counterpoint to Arthur's roar. "That's a rather unsubstantiated accusation, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Unsubstantiated?" Arthur roared, his face reddening. "I see it in her eyes, in her every move. She's after your money. Ethan, don't you see?" He turned to his son, his voice softening slightly, but the accusation remained. "She's not good enough for you." Ethan's shoulders slumped, the silent plea in his eyes now a silent surrender to his father's prejudice. He opened his mouth to speak, to defend Zara, to plead with his father, but no words came. The weight of his father's disapproval pressed down on him, crushing his spirit. The once vibrant joy of the occasion was now a suffocating shroud of despair. A hushed whisper rippled through the guests. Then, a crisp, official-looking envelope was handed to Arthur. The messenger, a harried-looking man in a dark suit, disappeared as quickly as he had arrived. Arthur stared at the envelope, the fury slowly draining from his face, replaced by a dawning confusion. He ripped it open, his eyes scanning the contents, his breath catching in his throat. The color drained from his face, leaving him ashen. He crumpled the paper in his fist, his body visibly shaking. The silence, once heavy with tension, now felt charged with something entirely new. anticipation, disbelief, and an unspoken truth about to shatter their world. The crumpled DNA results lay forgotten in Arthur's trembling hand. The opulent ballroom, moments before alive with music and laughter, was now a tomb of stunned silence. Crystal chandeliers glittered, mocking the icy chill that had settled over the room. The scent of lilies, once vibrant, now felt cloying, heavy with unspoken anxieties. Zara, her composure still remarkably intact, watched Arthur's struggle with a mixture of pity and wary apprehension. Her carefully crafted smile had vanished, replaced by a subtle tightening of her lips. The steel in her eyes, however, remained. She had faced down his prejudice with quiet dignity. Now, she faced his potential collapse with a stoic weariness. Ethan, pale and shaken, moved closer to Zara, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. He couldn't comprehend the seismic shift occurring before his eyes. His father, the man who had just launched a venomous attack on the woman he loved, was now broken. The weight of his father's disapproval, a lifelong burden, felt strangely lighter now, replaced by a bewildering wave of confusion. The silent plea he had been unable to utter moments before now transformed into a silent question. "What now?" Arthur looked up, his gaze flickering between Zara and Ethan, a raw vulnerability replacing the hard mask of his usual arrogance. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a mere rasp. It says, "It's impossible," he whispered, the words barely audible above the hushed murmurs of the stunned guests. The paper, still crumpled in his hand, felt like a verdict. Zara took a tentative step closer. The lilies in her hand felt heavy, their scent strangely suffocating now. "Impossible?" she asked softly, her voice betraying none of the turmoil churning within her. She spoke calmly, but the question hung in the air, laced with a quiet, controlled strength that belied the storm of emotions threatening to break through her carefully constructed facade. Ethan, his heart aching with a complexity of emotions, relief, shock, disbelief, and the lingering sting of his father's prejudice, moved to his father's side. He placed a hand on his father's shoulder, a gesture of both support and a silent acknowledgement of the impending reckoning. The weight of the past, the weight of his own prejudices, settled heavily upon him. He looked from his father to Zara, the silent chasm between them hinting at the turbulent path they were about to traverse. The future, once so bright, now shimmered with an uncertain, yet hopeful, light. The silence, broken only by shallow breaths and stifled sobs, echoed the unspoken questions that hung heavy in the air. What would come next? How could they possibly bridge the chasm created by years of ingrained prejudice and a shocking, life-altering revelation? The answer, for now, remained shrouded in the fragile silence of a world turned upside down. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the erratic thump of Arthur's heart, a frantic drumbeat against the hushed whispers of the guests. The scent of lilies, once a symbol of joyous celebration, now felt cloying, a heavy perfume of unspoken anxieties. Zara, her composure a fragile mask, felt the tremor in her own hands. The carefully constructed calm was cracking under the weight of the revelation. Arthur, his face ashen, stared at the crumpled DNA results. The crisp white paper, now a crumpled testament to his shattered world, mocked his arrogant certainty. Shame, raw and visceral, clawed at him. He had judged, condemned, and attacked a woman who was his own flesh and blood. The weight of his prejudice, his ingrained bigotry, crushed him. He saw Ethan's pained expression, the silent question hanging between them, a question that mirrored the turmoil in his own soul. Ethan reached out, his touch hesitant, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. The gesture was both a silent plea for understanding and a heartbreaking acknowledgement of the chasm that had opened between them. He, too, felt the sting of his own unintentional prejudice, a shadow of his father's ingrained biases he had never truly examined. The love he felt for Zara, so pure and strong, was now tainted by the knowledge of his father's horrific actions. "Father," Ethan began, his voice barely a whisper, I didn't know." The words hung in the air, heavy with regret and a dawning understanding of the complexity of his own feelings. His eyes, dark with unshed tears, shifted to Zara. The woman he loved, the woman he had defended against his father's vitriol, was his father's daughter. The enormity of it was almost too much to bear. Zara, her eyes fixed on her father, felt a complex mix of emotions. Hurt, yes, but also a flicker of something else, a tentative spark of hope. Could she forgive him? Could she ever bridge the chasm created by his prejudice? The question, both terrifying and liberating, hung in the air. She moved closer, the lilies in her hands a stark contrast to the emotional storm raging within her. "It's a lot to take in," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. The unspoken accusation hung heavy in the space between them. Not of the past, but of the future, of what would come next. Would he try to fix it? Or would he, now stripped of his arrogant confidence, crumble further? The answer remained shrouded in the silence, but the weight of expectation in the room seemed to push everyone forward toward that answer. The air in the opulent ballroom, thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken accusations, crackled with tension. Sunlight, filtering through the stained glass windows, cast long, dramatic shadows across the polished floor. Arthur, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his revelation, looked like a man suddenly aged decades. His usually impeccable suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, betraying the turmoil within. Zara, her composure still remarkably intact, met his gaze. Her eyes, however, held a depth of hurt that belied her calm exterior. The lilies in her hand, once symbols of bridal joy, felt heavy, almost burdensome. She saw not only the man who had insulted her, but a broken, vulnerable father she never knew she had. Ethan, caught between the wreckage of his father's prejudice and the blossoming love for Zara, felt torn. His hand, still resting lightly on his father's shoulder, was a physical manifestation of his conflicted loyalties. He saw the pain in Zara's eyes, the silent question hanging between them, a question echoing the turmoil in his own heart. "Father?" Ethan said again, his voice stronger this time, laced with a heartbreaking mixture of sorrow and understanding. I want to understand. I want to know why." Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat almost suffocating him. The words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of his actions, the realization of his ingrained biases. He looked from Ethan to Zara, his eyes swimming with unshed tears, a stark contrast to his usual arrogant demeanor. He saw the hurt, the confusion, the silent accusations. And he saw, finally, the daughter he had never known. Zara took a step closer, the lilies brushing against her silk gown. Their delicate scent a fragile counterpoint to the heavy emotions that hung in the air. "Why?" she repeated, her voice low, her tone laced with both pain and a hint of cautious hope. "Why did you do this?" The question wasn't just about the intrusion, the insults, the public humiliation. It was a question that burrowed deep, probing at the core of his prejudices, his values, his very being. Arthur opened his mouth to answer, but the words remained elusive, trapped by the shame that consumed him. The silence, once suffocating, now felt pregnant with the potential for healing, for forgiveness, for a future no one could have predicted just hours before. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy, a testament to the intricate unraveling of a life, a family, and the power of a long-hidden truth. The silence stretched, thick and heavy as the scent of lilies. Arthur's usually sharp eyes were clouded with a grief so profound it physically seemed to shrink him. The opulent ballroom, moments before a scene of joyous celebration, now felt like a mausoleum. Zara, despite the tremor in her hand, held her composure, her gaze unwavering. The pristine white of her dress, once a symbol of hope, now seemed to amplify the starkness of the situation. Sunlight slanted through the stained glass, painting streaks of crimson and gold across the polished floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the sudden stillness. Ethan, his heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions, watched his father and Zara. He saw the raw, unfiltered pain etched on his father's face, a stark contrast to the arrogant facade Arthur usually wore. He felt the weight of his own unspoken prejudices, the subtle echoes of his father's biases that had resonated within him, chillingly familiar. "Why, father?" Ethan repeated, his voice softer this time, a plea buried within the question. "Why did you do this? Why did you believe those things?" Arthur's lips trembled. He wanted to explain, to justify his actions, to somehow mitigate the horrific reality of his prejudice. But the words caught in his throat, choked by the sudden realization of the daughter he had lost. The daughter standing before him, wounded and bewildered. The weight of his actions, his ingrained biases, crashed down on him, crushing the arrogant businessman beneath the weight of his own making. Zara's gaze softened slightly, a flicker of something akin to pity crossing her features. The hurt remained, undeniable, but interwoven with it was a fragile thread of understanding, a cautious hope that perhaps, beneath the layers of prejudice and denial, a flicker of humanity still existed. The lilies in her hand felt less heavy now, replaced by a different kind of weight, the weight of a possible, albeit uncertain, reconciliation. I don't know," Arthur finally whispered, his voice barely audible above the faint strains of wedding music that seemed to echo the sorrow in the room. "I was blind. I let my fears control me." He looked at Zara, then at Ethan, his eyes swimming with unshed tears, a vulnerable expression that felt completely alien to his usual demeanor. He saw not just a bride he had tried to disgrace, but his own flesh and blood, bearing the wounds of his own ignorance. The silence deepened, heavy with unspoken emotions. The potential for healing, however, hung palpable in the air, fragile yet present. The heavy silence hung, broken only by the faint, mournful strains of the abandoned wedding music. Sunlight, filtering through the dusty grandeur of the ballroom, cast long shadows that seemed to stretch the already agonizing tension. Arthur, his shoulders slumped, looked smaller, his usual imposing presence shattered. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, since the DNA results were revealed. The lilies Zara held, once symbols of joyous union, now felt like a heavy burden, mirroring the weight of the unspoken accusations and the newly unearthed truth. Zara's composure, though outwardly maintained, was a thin veneer. The tremor in her hand, barely perceptible, betrayed the inner turmoil. Her eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence and warmth, were clouded with a hurt so profound it stole the color from her skin. She met Ethan's gaze, a silent communication passing between them, a shared understanding of the devastating revelation. Ethan, caught between his father and the woman he loved, felt the world tilting on its axis. His initial anger at his father's actions had been replaced by a deep, bewildering mix of shock, betrayal, and a profound sadness for Zara. He saw the pain in his father's eyes, a vulnerability he'd never witnessed before, a raw, unmasked grief that mirrored his own internal conflict. "Father," Ethan began, his voice low, hesitant. This changes everything." He didn't need to specify what everything encompassed. The unspoken words hung heavy in the air, thick with the implications of the destroyed wedding, the shattered trust, the revelation of a hidden family secret. Arthur's only response was a slight nod, his gaze fixed on the floor, his shoulders shaking imperceptibly. A tear escaped Zara's eye, tracing a glistening path through the carefully applied makeup. It was a silent acknowledgement of the pain, the betrayal, the utter upending of her life. She swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. The scent of lilies, once fresh and invigorating, now seemed cloying, suffocating. A stark reminder of the joyous occasion turned tragic. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. How could you do this?" The question hung in the air, a silent accusation against Arthur's prejudice, his blind arrogance. The opulent ballroom, a symbol of wealth and privilege moments before, now felt cold, sterile, a stark backdrop to the raw emotions swirling in the room. The weight of unspoken words, the devastation of broken trust, the pain of a revealed secret. All these elements combined to create a suffocating atmosphere, thick with the bitter taste of reality. The sunlight, once bright and celebratory, now seemed to mock them, highlighting the devastating impact of Arthur's actions and prejudices. The silence stretched, a taut, unbearable thing. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight, piercing the gloom of the abandoned ballroom. The scent of lilies, once vibrant, now clung to the air like a cloying sadness. Zara, her carefully composed facade crumbling, finally spoke, her voice a fragile whisper. How could you?" The question, laced with disbelief and a deep, welling hurt, hung between them. Arthur, his massive frame slumped in a chair, seemed to shrink, his usually imposing presence reduced to a pathetic shadow. He looked up, his eyes, usually sharp and calculating, filled with a raw, unacknowledged grief. The mask of control had slipped, revealing the vulnerability beneath. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the words catching in his throat. The weight of his actions, the shattering impact of his prejudice, seemed to crush him. Ethan, torn between his love for Zara and the shocking revelation of his father's past, moved to her side. He gently took her hand, his touch soft, reassuring. "Zara," he began, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry." He looked at his father, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and bewilderment. The anger had faded, replaced by a profound sadness for both of them. A single tear escaped Zara's eye, a silent testament to the pain she was enduring. Yet, even in her distress, there was a quiet strength, a resilience that shone through the hurt. She looked at Ethan, then back at her father. The unspoken question remained, hovering between them, heavy with implications. The unspoken question of whether forgiveness was even possible. The weight of his secret, the destruction he'd caused, hung heavy in the air like a suffocating blanket. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of joyous celebration, now felt like a tomb. The day's events felt like a sharp, bitter taste, the residue of a broken promise, of a life irrevocably changed. The sunlight seemed to mock their despair, casting long shadows that underscored the depth of their pain. Arthur's silence spoke volumes, the stark admission of his profound failure as a father, as a man. The air vibrated with the unspoken apologies, the unspoken pleas for forgiveness. The journey to reconciliation was long, arduous, and uncertain, but in the quiet acknowledgement of their shared grief, a fragile hope began to flicker. The path forward was uncertain, but it was clear, at least to Ethan, that the first step towards healing needed to begin now, in the suffocating silence of the devastated ballroom. The silence hung heavy, thick with the unspoken accusations and the weight of a shattered dream. The scent of lilies, sharp and cloying, filled the abandoned ballroom, a stark contrast to the joyous fragrance it had held just hours before. Zara, her composure finally fractured, touched the delicate lace of her ruined wedding dress, a single tear tracing a path through the intricate embroidery. How could you?" she whispered, the question laced with a pain that cut deeper than any insult. Arthur, his usually imposing figure slumped in a gilded chair, looked smaller, older, his eyes, usually sharp and calculating, filled with a raw, unfamiliar grief. The mask of control, meticulously crafted over decades, had finally slipped, revealing the vulnerable, terrified man beneath. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a strangled sob escaped. The words he desperately needed to express seemed trapped, choked by the enormity of his actions. Ethan, caught in the crossfire of his love for Zara and the devastating revelation about his father, moved to Zara's side. His touch, gentle on her arm, offered a silent promise of support, a refuge in the storm. "Zara," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears, I'm so incredibly sorry." He glanced at his father, his gaze a mixture of heartbreak and a dawning understanding. The anger he'd felt earlier had been replaced by a profound sadness. A low moan escaped Arthur, a sound of deep, unrestrained anguish. He looked up at Zara, his eyes pleading, begging for forgiveness he didn't yet know how to earn. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of celebration, now felt like a tomb, reflecting the profound devastation of their broken dreams. The sunlight filtering through the tall windows seemed to mock their despair, casting long shadows that emphasized their isolation, their shared pain. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy between them. Apologies, pleas for understanding, a desperate need for reconciliation. The journey ahead would be long and arduous, the path to forgiveness uncertain, but in the quiet acknowledgement of their shared grief, a fragile spark of hope, tenuous as a butterfly's wing, began to emerge. The first step towards healing, Ethan knew, had to begin in this suffocating silence. The silence stretched, a tangible thing pressing down on them. The shattered remnants of the wedding cake lay scattered on the floor, a grotesque parody of the joyous occasion it had represented. Crystal chandeliers glittered, mocking the despair in the room. Zara, her face pale and drawn, sat rigidly, the ruined lace of her dress clinging to her like a second skin. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now felt suffocating, mirroring the suffocating weight of Arthur's betrayal. Ethan reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, yet firm. He felt the tremor in her fingers, mirroring the tremor in his own heart. "I'm so sorry, Zara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I had no idea." Arthur, his face etched with a mixture of shame and disbelief, watched them, his gaze pleading. He had spent a lifetime building his empire, a life where his ruthlessness had always prevailed. But this was different. This wasn't a business deal gone wrong. This was a catastrophic failure of his own humanity. He hadn't just offended a stranger. He had wounded his own daughter. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing a nurse holding a sealed envelope. She approached Arthur, her expression neutral, yet conveying the gravity of the situation. His hand trembled as he ripped it open, his eyes scanning the crisp white paper. The words seemed to swim before his eyes, blurring into a chaotic jumble, then snapping into horrifying clarity. He stared at the results, a cold dread seeping into his bones, replacing the hot rage that had fueled his actions. The silence was broken only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow against his conscience. He looked up, his eyes filled with a raw, unadulterated horror. The mask of composure finally shattered, revealing the terrified man beneath. My daughter?" he choked out, the words barely audible. The truth, stark and undeniable, hung in the air, a heavy shroud suffocating the room. The opulent setting, the shattered dreams, the broken promises, all of it seemed to fade into insignificance beside this devastating revelation. The weight of his prejudice, his arrogance, his utter lack of compassion, crashed down upon him with crushing force. He destroyed his own daughter's happiness, driven by a prejudice he now realized was a pathetic, self-serving delusion. His life, his empire, his carefully constructed world, it all felt meaningless now, reduced to ashes by the searing fire of his own making. The lilies, the silence, the shattered cake, they were all symbols of this devastating, self-inflicted ruin. The air hung thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken accusations. Zara, her composure a fragile mask over raw hurt, met Arthur's gaze. Her eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were now pools of quiet sorrow. The shattered remains of the wedding cake, a sugary testament to ruined hopes, lay scattered like fallen stars. Ethan, his face pale and etched with anguish, reached for Zara's hand, his touch hesitant, apologetic. He felt the tremor in her fingers, a silent echo of the earthquake that had ripped through their lives. "I'm so sorry, Zara," he whispered, his voice a broken thread. "None of this. It's not what I wanted. I never." His voice trailed off, choked by emotion. Arthur, the picture of controlled rage moments before, now looked like a defeated king surveying his ruined kingdom. The opulent ballroom, once vibrant with life and laughter, felt like a mausoleum, reflecting the death of his carefully constructed world. The heavy silence was broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, each second a hammer blow against his conscience. He looked from Zara to Ethan, his face a canvas of disbelief, shame, and dawning horror. The truth, raw and undeniable, hung heavy in the air, thicker than the scent of lilies. The nurse's arrival was a stark interruption, a jarring intrusion into the suffocating silence. The sealed envelope, clutched in her hand, felt like a death sentence. Arthur's hand trembled as he tore it open, his eyes scanning the crisp white paper. The words swam before him, blurring into a chaotic jumble, then snapping into horrifying clarity. His breath hitched in his throat, a strangled gasp of disbelief. He stared at the results, the color draining from his face, leaving him a ghost of his former self. My daughter?" he whispered, the words lost in the vastness of the ballroom. The weight of his prejudice, his arrogant blindness, his callous disregard for another human being, crashed down on him with the force of a tidal wave. He had not simply disrupted a wedding. He had shattered his own daughter's life, driven by a prejudice so deeply ingrained it felt like a part of his very being. The lilies, the silence, the shattered cake, they were all symbols of his self-inflicted ruin, a monument to his arrogance. His life, his empire, his carefully constructed facade, it all felt insignificant, meaningless, ashes in the wind. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock. Crystal chandeliers glittered, mocking the shattered remnants of the wedding cake, a sugary testament to a life irrevocably altered. Zara, her composure a fragile veneer, met Arthur's gaze. The accusation in his eyes, moments before incandescent, now flickered with a dawning horror. He saw it then, the resemblance, faint but undeniable, in her eyes, in the subtle curve of her jawline. The lilies, once fragrant, now held a cloying sweetness, mirroring the sickening realization blooming in his gut. Ethan, his hands still clasped in Zara's, felt the tremor in her fingers intensify. He squeezed gently, offering silent support against the onslaught of unspoken emotions. The opulent ballroom, once a haven of celebration, felt claustrophobic, its gilded cage trapping them in the aftermath of Arthur's explosive intrusion. My daughter?" Arthur whispered again, the words barely audible above the pounding of his own heart. Shame, raw and visceral, washed over him, leaving behind a stark emptiness. He had judged, condemned, and insulted a woman who was his own flesh and blood. The weight of his prejudice, the years of ingrained bias, crushed him. He looked from Zara's tear-streaked face to Ethan's, a mixture of anguish and disbelief etched on his son's features. The nurse, a small, unassuming figure in the grandeur of the ballroom, cleared her throat. The sealed envelope, a harbinger of their new reality, seemed to hum with unspoken implications. Arthur's carefully constructed world crumbled around him, replaced by a profound and debilitating sense of self-loathing. He had not just ruined a wedding. He had betrayed his own child, driven by a blindness so complete it left him reeling. The lilies, the silence, the shattered cake, all symbols of his devastating self-destruction. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a tomb. His empire, his wealth, his carefully constructed life, all felt meaningless, ephemeral. The truth, stark and unforgiving, hung heavy in the air, a bitter counterpoint to the sweetness of the lilies. The future, once so clear, now stretched before them, an uncertain, daunting landscape. The nurse, her face pale under the harsh glare of the chandeliers, handed the sealed envelope to Arthur. He felt the crisp paper tremble in his hand, a stark contrast to the tremor that shook his own body. The lilies, their scent now suffocating, seemed to mock his silent despair. He could hear the faint thrum of the ballroom music, a discordant melody against the deafening silence in his ears. Ethan, his eyes filled with a heartbreaking mixture of shock and betrayal, reached out a hand, his touch hesitant. Zara, however, remained impassive, her face a mask of controlled hurt. The opulent surroundings, once symbols of joy and celebration, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping them all in the aftermath of Arthur's disastrous intrusion. "Open it." Zara's voice, though quiet, carried the weight of unspoken accusations. Her gaze, though unwavering, held a flicker of something else, a desperate hope. Arthur felt a pang of guilt, a sharp, searing pain that pierced through his self-loathing. He hadn't just insulted her. He'd condemned her, judged her based on his own poisonous prejudices. He tore open the envelope, the crisp sound echoing in the heavy silence. His eyes scanned the results, the stark black and white words blurring in his vision. A wave of nausea washed over him, the opulent ballroom swaying precariously around him. The truth was undeniable, laid bare in cold, clinical language. He, Arthur Blackwood, the powerful businessman, was undone by a single sheet of paper. His carefully constructed world, his carefully cultivated image, shattered into a million pieces. He looked at Zara again, truly seeing her for the first time. The resemblance, once a faint whisper, was now undeniable. The curve of her jaw, the set of her eyes, they were echoes of his own features, a mirror reflecting a past he had ruthlessly ignored. His carefully built wall of denial crumbled, replaced by a tsunami of regret. His breath hitched in his throat, a strangled sob threatening to escape. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The weight of his actions, the cruelty of his judgment, pressed down on him, crushing him beneath its unforgiving burden. The silence, broken only by the ticking clock, felt heavy, suffocating. He had not only ruined a wedding, he had destroyed a potential relationship with his own child. The bitter taste of his own prejudice filled his mouth, leaving a foul residue of shame and regret. The opulent ballroom, once a testament to his success, suddenly felt like a tomb, a suffocating reminder of his colossal failure. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the erratic thump of Arthur's heart against his ribs. The lilies, once symbols of celebratory fragrance, now felt cloying, their sweetness a cruel mockery of his internal turmoil. He stared at the DNA results, the stark black and white a stark contrast to the swirling chaos in his mind. Zara, her face a carefully constructed mask of quiet dignity, watched him with an intensity that pierced through his self-loathing. Ethan, his face ashen, stepped closer, his hand hovering hesitantly over his father's arm. "Dad," he began, his voice barely a whisper, the word laced with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. Arthur finally found his voice, a rasping croak that barely registered above the muted music. It can't be," he stammered, his eyes darting from the paper to Zara's impassive face. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a suffocating prison. Zara's voice, when she finally spoke, cut through the suffocating silence like a knife. "It is," she stated, her tone quiet but unwavering. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a stark contrast to the composure she maintained. "And your prejudice. It almost cost us everything." Her gaze, though filled with hurt, held a flicker of something else, a fragile hope. The weight of his actions crashed down on Arthur, the full impact of his arrogance and prejudice hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He judged her, condemned her based on nothing but his own ingrained biases. The shame was visceral, a burning brand on his soul. He looked at Ethan, saw the pain etched on his son's face, a pain born from both betrayal and the shattering of his carefully constructed worldview. The guilt was almost unbearable. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words caught in his throat. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a distant clock, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile remnants of his self-respect. He had not only insulted Zara, he'd insulted the very essence of his son's love, and he had almost destroyed a family he hadn't even known existed. The opulent surroundings, once a source of pride, now mocked him, a stark reminder of his monumental failure. The scent of lilies, now sickeningly sweet, clung to the heavy silence. He was drowning in his own making, a self-made prison of prejudice and regret. The weight of silence pressed down, heavier than any ballroom chandelier. Arthur, his face a mask of stunned disbelief, stared at the DNA results, the crisp white paper a stark contrast to the swirling turmoil within him. The opulent ballroom, moments ago a stage for his arrogant intrusion, now felt like a suffocating cage. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now cloyed, a sickly sweet reminder of his monumental blunder. Zara, her composure a fragile shield against the onslaught of emotions, met his gaze. Her eyes, usually sparkling with warmth, were now pools of quiet hurt, reflecting the shattered fragments of her wedding day. A single tear escaped, tracing a glistening path down her cheek, a stark testament to her controlled grief. Ethan, his face etched with a mixture of disbelief and heartbreak, reached out a hesitant hand, his touch lingering briefly on his father's arm before retracting. "Dad?" he whispered, the word laden with a mixture of pain and unspoken accusations. The love he had so openly declared moments before now felt fragile, threatened by the revelation that shattered their world. The low hum of conversation from the other guests faded into a distant murmur, replaced by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow against Arthur's fragile ego. He judged her, condemned her, based on nothing but his ingrained prejudice. The shame was a physical weight, a burning brand on his soul. He looked at Ethan, saw the pain etched deep in his son's face, a reflection of his own destructive actions. The guilt was suffocating, a crushing weight that threatened to break him. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the realization of his colossal mistake. He'd not only insulted Zara, he'd insulted the very essence of his son's love, and he'd nearly destroyed a family he hadn't known existed. The opulent surroundings mocked his arrogance, the lavish decor a cruel irony against his personal devastation. He was drowning in a sea of his own making, a self-made prison of prejudice and regret. The lilies, once symbols of joy, now felt like a funeral wreath, their fragrance a morbid reminder of his failure. The truth, raw and brutal, hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed facade of his life. He was exposed, stripped bare, and the weight of his actions pressed down, threatening to crush him completely. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating as the scent of lilies. Arthur's gaze, fixed on the DNA results, was unblinking, the stark white paper mirroring the stark terror blooming in his chest. He felt the weight of the ballroom, the opulent decor suddenly oppressive, a gilded cage built on a foundation of his own ignorance. Zara, her composure a fragile mask, met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the glittering chandeliers, but with a depth of hurt that outweighed all the room's brilliance. A single tear, a tiny rebellion against her controlled grief, escaped and traced a glistening path down her cheek. Ethan, his face pale, his hand hovering uncertainly near his father's arm, whispered, "Dad." The word hung in the air, fragile as a butterfly's wing, carrying the weight of unspoken accusations and shattered expectations. A low hum of hushed conversation from the other guests drifted to them, a distant murmur against the pounding of Arthur's heart. He saw the pity in the glances cast his way, the whispers turning into a tide of shocked silence. His carefully constructed world, built on wealth and power, crumbled around him, revealing the cracked foundation of his prejudice. He judged her, condemned her, based on nothing but his ingrained biases. Now the truth was a brutal, unforgiving mirror, reflecting the ugliness of his actions. The shame was a searing brand, and the guilt, a crushing weight threatening to break him. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but the words refused to come. The realization of his colossal mistake choked him, a bitter taste coating his tongue. He hadn't just insulted Zara. He'd wounded his son's heart, and shattered the potential of a family he'd never known existed. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of his success, felt like a mocking reminder of his failure. The lilies, once celebratory, now seemed like funeral blooms, their fragrance a suffocating sweetness. The weight of his actions pressed down, threatening to crush him. He looked at Ethan, seeing his son's pain mirrored in his own desolate reflection. The truth was a stark, unforgiving reality, a sharp contrast to the carefully constructed life he'd led, built on lies and prejudices. He was exposed, naked in his vulnerability. The silence, broken only by the relentless ticking of a grandfather clock, felt heavier than any ballroom chandelier. The air hung heavy, thick with the unspoken. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness mirroring the turmoil in Arthur's soul. His gaze, locked on the DNA results, was a frozen mask of disbelief. The opulent ballroom, moments ago a stage for his arrogant intrusion, now felt like a suffocating pressure chamber. Ethan, his face ashen, reached out a tentative hand, his touch hesitant. "Dad," he whispered, the word fragile, a testament to the shattering of his carefully constructed world. Zara, her composure a marvel of quiet strength, remained motionless. A single tear, a silent testament to her hurt, traced a glistening path down her cheek, a stark contrast to the glittering chandeliers above. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, each second an agonizing hammer blow against Arthur's already fractured self. He saw the pity in the eyes of the other guests, their hushed whispers a chorus of condemnation he deserved. His carefully constructed world, built on wealth and power, was crumbling. The foundation, he now realized with sickening clarity, had always been rotten, built on prejudice and ignorance. He had judged, condemned, based on nothing more than the color of her skin, the fabric of her dress. The weight of his actions pressed down, suffocating him. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. Shame, raw and visceral, burned in his chest, a searing brand on his conscience. He hadn't just insulted Zara. He'd wounded his son, shattered the possibility of a family he'd never known existed. The lilies, the champagne, the elegant music. All of it was suddenly a cruel mockery. His carefully curated image, the mask he wore so expertly in the business world, was ripped away. Exposed, naked in his vulnerability, the realization of his colossal mistake struck him with brutal force. He looked at Ethan, seeing the pain mirrored in his son's desolate eyes, a reflection of his own self-loathing. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of triumph, now felt like a tomb, a monument to his monumental failure. The silence stretched, a heavy cloak of regret, a stark contrast to the loud arrogance of his arrival. The truth, stark and unforgiving, was a brutal mirror reflecting back the ugliness of his own soul. He had to begin the long, arduous journey of repair. The journey had begun. The silence stretched, a tangible entity pressing down on them. The scent of lilies, sharp and cloying, seemed to mock the stunned stillness. Arthur's breath hitched, a ragged sound in the suffocating quiet. He stared at the DNA report, the stark black and white a stark contrast to the vibrant colors of the opulent ballroom, now a mausoleum of his own making. Ethan's hand, still outstretched, trembled slightly. His father's silence was a crushing weight. Zara, however, broke the spell. A faint tremor ran through her, a ripple in the otherwise still lake of her composure. She moved, slowly, deliberately, her graceful movements a stark contrast to the chaos within the room. She picked up a discarded champagne flute, the crystal cold against her fingers, a small comfort in the face of the overwhelming revelation. "So," she said, her voice low, even, but laced with an undercurrent of steel, "this changes things." The words hung in the air, simple yet devastating in their implications. Arthur flinched, the weight of his actions finally settling upon him. He saw the hurt in her eyes, a quiet sadness that mirrored his own burgeoning sense of shame. He had condemned her, judged her, based on a prejudice so ingrained it had become a part of his very being. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Ethan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Zara, he faltered, unable to articulate the turmoil within him. His love for Zara battled with the shock of his father's betrayal, a devastating cocktail of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. He looked from his father to Zara, a silent plea for understanding etched on his face. The carefully constructed walls of his own assumptions crumbled, revealing the prejudice he himself had unwittingly harbored. Arthur finally found his voice, a choked whisper. I didn't know." The words were pathetic, insufficient, a feeble attempt to mitigate the enormity of his actions. He saw the doubt flicker in Zara's eyes, the hurt still present but softened slightly by a hint of curiosity, perhaps even a flicker of pity. The path ahead was long and arduous, filled with the thorny vines of guilt and regret. But somewhere, in the wreckage of his carefully constructed world, a seed of hope took root. The journey of atonement had begun. The chandelier's light glinted off the unshed tears tracing paths down Zara's cheeks. The opulent ballroom, moments ago a scene of joyous celebration, now felt like a cold, echoing tomb. The silence, thick with unspoken accusations and the weight of a shocking revelation, hung heavy in the air. The scent of lilies, once sweet, now felt cloying, suffocating. Arthur, his face ashen, avoided her gaze. His usually sharp eyes, now dull with shame, darted around the room, seeking escape from the consequences of his actions. The crispness of his expensive suit felt ironically at odds with the turmoil raging within him. He ran a trembling hand through his silver hair, the gesture betraying the depth of his inner conflict. Ethan, caught between the wreckage of his father's prejudice and his unwavering love for Zara, stood frozen, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. His earlier defiance had crumbled, replaced by a crushing sense of betrayal. The exquisite champagne he held, once a symbol of celebration, now felt like lead in his hand. Zara, ever poised, took a deep breath. The controlled tremor in her voice belied the turmoil within. "Father," she said, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. The carefully constructed facade of composure began to crack, revealing the hurt beneath. This explains so much." Her eyes, dark and luminous, held a mixture of pain and a flicker of something else. A cautious hope, perhaps. Arthur finally met her gaze, his eyes brimming with a mixture of remorse and fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The weight of his actions, of his ingrained prejudices, pressed down on him, suffocating him. The carefully constructed world he had built on the foundation of his wealth and societal standing was crumbling around him. He saw the pain he had caused reflected in her eyes, and it was worse than any business deal gone wrong, any financial loss he could imagine. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant strains of music from a deserted bandstand, a melancholic counterpoint to the drama unfolding before them. The room, once alive with vibrant energy, now felt barren and cold, mirroring the chill that had settled in Arthur's heart. The weight of his revelation was immense. He had not only insulted and humiliated her, he had nearly destroyed her happiness, all out of a prejudice born from ignorance and fear. The truth was far more devastating than he could have ever imagined. The silence stretched, a tangible thing, thick with the unspoken. Crystal chandeliers cast long, shimmering shadows across the deserted ballroom, their light reflecting off the unshed tears on Zara's cheeks. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now clung to the air like a suffocating shroud. Arthur's expensive suit, usually a mark of his power, felt like a heavy, constricting weight. He shifted uncomfortably, the polished marble floor cold beneath his feet. Ethan, his face pale and drawn, watched his father, his love for Zara warring with a newly awakened understanding of his own unconscious prejudices. He had echoed his father's suspicions, albeit more subtly, and the guilt gnawed at him. Zara, her composure a fragile mask, finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. This explains so much," she said, her gaze fixed on the crumpled DNA results in Arthur's trembling hand. The controlled tremor in her voice was a stark contrast to the storm raging within her. The cautious hope that had flickered moments before was now a fragile ember, threatened by the chilling realization of her father's ingrained biases. A strangled sob escaped Arthur's lips. He looked at his son, then back at Zara, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and profound regret. The carefully constructed walls of his life, his wealth, his social standing, his self-deception were crumbling around him, revealing the raw, painful truth beneath. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to somehow undo the damage, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the weight of his actions. Ethan stepped forward, his voice low and hesitant. "Dad," he began, his eyes searching his father's face. I didn't understand. I never saw." He trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of his own disappointment and the shame he felt for his own unwitting participation in his father's prejudice. Zara's gaze softened slightly, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She saw the genuine remorse in Ethan's expression, the struggle to reconcile his love for her with the ingrained beliefs he had inherited. The initial hurt remained, a sharp, lingering pain, but it was tempered by a growing awareness of the complex web of emotions that bound them together. The weight of the revelation was slowly shifting, revealing a possibility of forgiveness, of healing, of a future that might, just might, defy the expectations of the past. The cold emptiness of the ballroom seemed to lessen, replaced by the faintest glimmer of hope, as fragile as a newborn's breath. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Arthur's expensive cufflinks, usually symbols of his success, felt like lead weights against his skin. He stared at the crumpled DNA results, the stark black print mocking his carefully constructed world. The opulent ballroom, moments before a scene of joyous celebration, now felt like a tomb. Zara moved to a nearby window, her back to him, the moonlight outlining the delicate curve of her shoulder. The city lights twinkled below, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. The initial shock was giving way to a deeper, colder hurt, not just from the revelation of her father, but from the casual racism she'd faced, the prejudice that had almost stolen her happiness. Ethan hesitantly approached his father, the weight of his own unspoken prejudices a crushing burden. He'd mirrored his father's suspicion, albeit with less overt malice, but the guilt was undeniable. He reached out a hand, then hesitated, the gesture mirroring his emotional turmoil. "Dad," he began, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. I never saw." Arthur looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, his usual arrogance replaced by a raw, vulnerable pain. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his regret. The carefully crafted facade he'd maintained for years was shattering, revealing the insecure, prejudiced man beneath. He ran a hand through his silver hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. I can't believe it," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "My daughter. I was so blind." He looked at Zara, his gaze pleading, yet tinged with fear of rejection. The carefully cultivated walls of his world were crumbling around him, revealing the painful truth beneath. He hadn't just hurt Zara. He had wounded a part of himself he'd never acknowledged. The weight of his actions, his ingrained biases, was crushing. Zara turned, her face etched with a mixture of pain and disbelief. Her eyes, once sparkling with joy, were now clouded with a cautious hope, an ember threatened by the gale of his past actions. "Explain," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet carrying the weight of years of unspoken hurts. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations and a dawning understanding. The opulent setting, once a symbol of joy, now felt like a stark reminder of the damage caused. The lilies, once symbols of purity, felt suffocating, a heavy perfume clinging to the air like a shroud. The truth had arrived, shattering their lives, laying bare the deep wounds inflicted by prejudice and intolerance. The path ahead would be arduous, fraught with difficulties. But within the shattered pieces of their lives, the faint glimmer of hope, of potential forgiveness and healing, was present. The heavy silence stretched, punctuated only by Zara's shallow breaths. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness mirroring the bitterness in the air. Arthur, his face ashen, stared at his trembling hands, the expensive cufflinks digging into his skin. He looked up, catching Zara's gaze, a glacial stillness that chilled him to the bone. The carefully constructed walls of his privilege had crumbled, revealing a man consumed by his own making. Ethan, his face pale, stood beside his father, the weight of his own unspoken prejudices pressing down on him. He hadn't fully understood the depth of his father's racism, but the casual bigotry had seeped into him, staining his perceptions of Zara. Now, the truth felt like a brutal blow, shattering his carefully built perception of himself. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The words felt inadequate, hollow, unable to express the turmoil within. He looked at Zara, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and shame. He knew an apology was insufficient. Zara didn't speak immediately. Her eyes, once sparkling with joy, were now clouded with a deep, simmering hurt. The realization of her father's presence, the callous rejection, and the underlying racism had wounded her deeply. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words and years of pent-up emotions. Then, slowly, she spoke, her voice low and steady, each word carrying the weight of years of quiet dignity. "Your ignorance doesn't excuse your actions, Ethan, nor your father's." She moved to a nearby chaise lounge, the plush velvet cold beneath her fingers. Arthur cleared his throat, the sound raspy and strained. "Zara," he began, his voice trembling. I need to explain. There's so much." He broke off, overwhelmed by the enormity of his actions and the sheer weight of his regret. The man who had commanded boardrooms with an iron fist was reduced to a shell of himself, his powerlessness a stark contrast to his usual demeanor. The opulent ballroom, a testament to Arthur's success, now felt like a cage, trapping him in the consequences of his actions. The faint murmur of the wedding party, still gathered in shock and disbelief, was a constant, painful reminder of the life he'd almost destroyed. The champagne flutes, still half-filled, mocked the shattered remnants of his carefully constructed world. The truth, stark and undeniable, had arrived, casting a long, dark shadow over everything. The path to redemption, if there was one, seemed impossibly long and arduous. The air hung heavy, thick with the unspoken. The scent of lilies, now cloying, battled with the metallic tang of fear in Arthur's nostrils. His expensive suit felt suddenly constricting, the silk a suffocating weight against his skin. He watched Zara, her composure a fragile mask barely concealing the hurt in her eyes. Her silence was a weapon, sharper than any accusation. Ethan shifted beside his father, his guilt palpable. He'd echoed his father's prejudices, albeit silently, and the revelation felt like a betrayal of himself as much as Zara. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, the words catching in his throat. He couldn't fix this. He could only watch his father and the woman he loved crumble under the weight of the truth. A choked sob escaped Zara, breaking the suffocating silence. She covered her face with trembling hands, the diamond ring on her finger flashing briefly in the dim light. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of joy, now felt like a tomb. The scattered rose petals, previously scattered with festive abandon, looked like fallen confetti from a ruined celebration. Arthur took a tentative step towards Zara. "Zara," he began, his voice a ragged whisper, barely audible above the muted whispers of the stunned guests. He reached out a hand, then hesitated, unsure if she would even allow him to touch her. The weight of his actions, the years of prejudice and denial, crashed down on him, a crushing weight of regret. I didn't know," he managed, his words swallowed by the enormity of his mistake. The shame was a physical thing, burning in his throat, clogging his chest. He felt the gaze of the remaining wedding guests, their pity and judgment a tangible presence. Zara looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and glistening with unshed tears. "Knowing is irrelevant," she said, her voice low and steady, each word precise and sharp. "Your actions spoke louder than any words could ever express. The hurt is real, and the damage profound. The diamond ring felt heavy and cold on her finger, a symbol of a future irrevocably altered. The champagne flutes, abandoned on nearby tables, seemed to mock the celebration that had been cruelly stolen. The path forward seemed impossibly steep and long, but somewhere within the crushing weight of revelation, a faint spark of hope flickered. The shock was immense, but perhaps, just perhaps, this brutal truth could be the first step towards something better. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the adjacent room. Arthur's breath hitched in his chest, a ragged sound swallowed by the opulent emptiness of the ballroom. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now felt cloying, a suffocating sweetness mirroring the bitter taste of his revelation. He watched Zara, her face pale, her composure a fragile shield against the storm raging within. The diamond ring on her finger, a symbol of a future stolen, glinted coldly in the subdued light. Ethan, his face etched with a pain mirroring his father's, reached out a hesitant hand towards Zara. "Zara," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. The words caught in his throat, a stark contrast to the confident pronouncements he'd made earlier. His carefully constructed worldview, built on the foundations of his father's prejudice, lay shattered. Zara's gaze, though filled with hurt, held a quiet dignity. She met Ethan's gaze, her eyes softening slightly before her gaze shifted to her father. "Knowing is irrelevant, father," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying the weight of years of unspoken hurt. "Your actions, the assumptions, they spoke louder than any words." The tremor in her voice betrayed the carefully constructed composure. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, glistening like a fallen star against her flawless skin. Arthur flinched, the weight of his actions settling upon him with crushing force. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of joy, now felt like a gilded cage, its lavish decorations mocking his own moral bankruptcy. He stumbled forward, his expensive shoes making no sound on the thick carpet, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a suffocating shroud. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer a desperate apology, but the words wouldn't come. Shame choked him, the bitter taste of regret rising in his throat. He reached out a trembling hand toward Zara, his fingers outstretched as if to grasp at a fading dream. He wanted to explain, to undo the damage, but he knew it was beyond repair. The damage he'd inflicted was a chasm, deep and wide, and the road to redemption seemed impossibly long and steep. The air crackled with unspoken emotions: anger, shame, regret, and a fragile tendril of hope. The future, once a picture of bright promise, now hung shrouded in uncertainty. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the faint whisper of the air conditioning. Crystal chandeliers glittered, mocking the emotional devastation in the room. Arthur, his face ashen, stared at Zara, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. The scent of lilies, sharp and cloying, filled his nostrils, a bitter reminder of the ruined celebration. He saw the unshed tears shimmering in Zara's eyes, a stark contrast to her otherwise composed exterior. Ethan, his face a mask of disbelief and hurt, stepped forward, his hand outstretched hesitantly. "Zara," he began, his voice a raw whisper. I didn't know." His words hung in the air, inadequate, fragile. The meticulously crafted facade of his father's prejudices, a worldview he'd unconsciously absorbed, crumbled before his eyes. The love he felt for Zara, so potent and undeniable, clashed violently with the revelation of his father's appalling behavior. Zara's gaze, though filled with pain, held a steely strength. She looked at her father, the pain etched deep into her features. "Your actions spoke volumes, father," she said, her voice low and controlled, each word carrying the weight of years of unspoken hurt and silent resentment. The carefully constructed composure she'd maintained throughout the ordeal began to fracture. A single tear escaped, tracing a glistening path down her cheek. Arthur flinched, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some explanation, some feeble defense, but the words caught in his throat. Shame, thick and suffocating, choked him. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of lavish excess, now felt like a gilded cage, its beauty a cruel mockery of his moral failings. He reached out a trembling hand towards Zara, a desperate plea for forgiveness hanging in the unspoken space between them. The weight of his prejudices, the years of ingrained biases, crashed down upon him with the full force of a tidal wave. He saw the hurt in Ethan's eyes, the silent accusation in his son's pained expression. He had not only hurt Zara but also damaged his relationship with his son, poisoning their bond with his bigotry. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping for breath, desperate for redemption. The path ahead seemed impossibly long and steep, the chasm between him and his daughter seeming unbridgeable. But in the depths of his despair, a flicker of hope ignited, a fragile ember in the darkness of his shame. He had to atone. He had to begin. The heavy silence pressed down, thick and suffocating. Crystal shards scattered across the polished marble floor mirrored the fragments of Arthur's shattered world. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now clung to the air like a shroud. He watched Zara, her composure a fragile mask barely concealing the pain in her eyes. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to his failings. Ethan, his face pale and drawn, looked from his father to Zara, the conflict tearing at him. He'd loved Zara fiercely, blindly, and now the foundation of his love was shaken to its core. He felt betrayed, not just by his father, but by his own unconscious prejudices. Arthur opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Shame, a bitter poison, choked him. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but the years of ingrained bigotry had left him speechless, helpless. He reached for Zara, his hand trembling, a desperate plea for connection in the echoing silence. Zara didn't flinch away from his touch, but her eyes remained fixed on his, conveying a depth of hurt that cut him to the bone. "Father," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the thrum of the stunned silence. "How could you?" The question hung in the air, a simple yet devastating indictment. The weight of his actions, the years of prejudice, slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. He saw the hurt in Ethan's eyes, the silent accusation, the fragile hope flickering and dying. He had not only scorned Zara, but he had wounded his son, poisoning the relationship with his hateful blindness. A low sob escaped Arthur's lips. He sank onto a nearby chair, the ornate gold legs digging into the polished floor. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded prison, a testament to his moral bankruptcy. He covered his face with his hands, the shame a burning brand against his skin. The lilies, sharp and suffocating, seemed to mock him. He had to atone. He had to start. Now, the silence stretched, a taut thread threatening to snap. The scent of lilies, heavy and cloying, fought with the metallic tang of blood. A small cut on Zara's hand, unnoticed until now, a tiny crimson blossom against the ivory of her dress. Arthur's gaze, usually sharp and calculating, was dull, clouded with a dawning horror. He saw not just a scorned woman, but a reflection of his own failure, staring back at him from those heartbroken eyes. Ethan moved, a silent tremor running through him. He reached for Zara's hand, his touch hesitant, unsure. He saw the way her fingers trembled, the delicate pulse fluttering beneath his own. He'd seen this strength before, the quiet dignity that had captivated him, and now, witnessing its fragility, a fresh wave of grief washed over him. "Zara," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. I didn't know." His words were clumsy, inadequate, failing to capture the storm of emotions raging within him. The prejudice he hadn't even realized he held, the casual bigotry he'd absorbed from his father, now felt like a bitter betrayal of the woman he loved. Zara looked at him, her gaze lingering for a long moment before she turned to her father. The controlled composure she'd maintained shattered, replaced by a raw, wounded vulnerability. "How could you?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of years of unspoken pain. "Judge me before even knowing me." A single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek. The opulent ballroom, moments ago vibrant with life and laughter, now felt cold and empty. The music, abruptly silenced, left a hollow space where joy had resided. The scattered rose petals, once strewn like confetti, seemed to mock the festive occasion, now tainted by betrayal and revelation. Arthur looked from Ethan to Zara, the weight of his actions crushing him. The DNA results, the undeniable truth, had laid bare not just his prejudice, but the depth of his self-deception. He had judged, condemned, and attempted to destroy a life, all based on a hateful misconception. The man who had always prided himself on his control now felt utterly powerless. His wealth, his influence, his carefully constructed world, all felt meaningless in the face of this devastating truth. The silence that hung in the air was thick, heavy with unspoken accusations, remorse, and a fragile hope for redemption. The journey to forgiveness had begun, but the road ahead remained long and arduous. The silence hung heavy, thick with the unspoken. Crystal chandeliers cast long, distorted shadows across the room, turning the opulent ballroom into a surreal dreamscape. The scent of lilies, usually sweet, now felt cloying, suffocating. Arthur, his face ashen, stared at the DNA report, the crisp white paper a stark contrast to the swirling chaos in his mind. He'd built his life on control, yet here he was utterly powerless, the architect of his own destruction. Ethan, his eyes mirroring his father's shock, reached out a trembling hand to Zara. He'd loved her, truly loved her, and the revelation of her true identity, his father's daughter, shattered his world. The love he felt remained, but now it was tainted with a bitter undercurrent of betrayal. He couldn't comprehend his father's actions, his own ingrained prejudices surfacing, a ghostly echo of Arthur's hateful pronouncements. Zara, her composure finally cracking, let a single tear escape. It traced a slow path down her cheek, a stark contrast to the carefully applied makeup, highlighting the vulnerability beneath her poised exterior. How could you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her own heart. The years of unspoken pain, the silent judgment she'd endured, seemed to coalesce into this single heart-wrenching question. The weight of the unspoken accusations pressed down on them. Arthur's carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing a man riddled with guilt and shame. His wealth, his power, the very foundation of his life, felt meaningless. The opulent surroundings, once a symbol of his success, now mocked his failure. The vibrant colors of the wedding decorations appeared dull, lifeless. A single, stray rose petal drifted to the floor, a tiny crimson splash against the ivory carpet, mirroring the blood from Zara's unnoticed cut. It felt symbolic, a tiny wound opening into a vast chasm of regret and hurt. The air thrummed with unspoken emotions, shock, disbelief, betrayal, and the faintest glimmer of hope, a fragile seed planted amidst the wreckage. The journey towards forgiveness had just begun, a long and arduous path that lay ahead, fraught with emotional pain and uncertainty. The silence stretched, a tangible entity in the opulent ballroom. Crystal fragments, scattered from a shattered vase, a casualty of Arthur's earlier outburst, glittered under the dimmed lights. The air, thick with the scent of lilies and unspoken accusations, felt heavy, suffocating. Zara touched the small cut on her hand, a stark crimson against her ivory gown, a silent testament to the night's turmoil. How could you?" she repeated, her voice trembling, barely a whisper against the throbbing silence. The question hung in the air, a barbed arrow aimed at Arthur's heart. He stared at the DNA report, his reflection shimmering in the polished surface of a nearby table, a stranger staring back at him, etched with guilt and disbelief. The weight of his prejudices, the years of ingrained bias, crushed him. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some feeble explanation, but no words came. Ethan, caught between his love for Zara and the shattering revelation of his father's actions, watched them both, his heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. He saw the raw hurt in Zara's eyes, the unyielding pain behind her carefully maintained composure. He saw the collapse of his father's carefully constructed facade, the man he knew replaced by a shell of guilt and shame. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of celebration, now felt like a prison, its gilded cages trapping them in a web of unspoken truths. The faint strains of a distant orchestra, attempting to resume the interrupted wedding, seemed mocking, a cruel counterpoint to the emotional wreckage. Zara looked at Ethan, her gaze searching, seeking solace in his eyes. The love she saw there, despite the storm raging around them, offered a flicker of hope, a fragile ember in the vast darkness. Slowly, deliberately, she rose. The movement was graceful, yet the tremor in her hands betrayed her inner turmoil. "I need some air," she murmured, her voice quiet yet firm, a stark contrast to the tempest raging within her. She turned and walked away, leaving Arthur and Ethan in the wreckage of their shattered world, the weight of their actions pressing down upon them, heavy and inescapable. The journey towards forgiveness had begun, a path fraught with pain and uncertainty, but with the smallest spark of hope glowing in the distance. The ballroom's glittering facade felt cruelly ironic, a shimmering mask hiding the raw devastation within. Zara's retreating form, a wisp of ivory against the dark mahogany paneling, left a void in the opulent space. Arthur, his face ashen, remained rooted to the spot, the DNA report clutched in his trembling hand. The crisp paper crinkled, a counterpoint to the suffocating silence. Ethan, torn, moved towards his father, the weight of unspoken accusations heavy in the air. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice barely a breath, his gaze flickering between the crumpled report and his father's ravaged expression. The years of ingrained prejudice, of casual racism, now manifested as a tangible, horrifying truth. Arthur's carefully constructed world, built on wealth and privilege, lay in ruins. Arthur looked up, his eyes, usually sharp and calculating, now dull with shame. He saw in Ethan's gaze not just sorrow, but a profound disillusionment, a shattering of the father-son bond. The lily-scented air seemed to thicken, a physical manifestation of the crushing weight of his actions. Arthur's voice cracked, the sound swallowed by the opulent surroundings. He tried to speak, to explain, to justify, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the bitter taste of his own hypocrisy. The meticulously planned wedding, a symbol of his son's happiness, had imploded, a testament to his own destructive prejudices. He saw Zara, that night, not as a manipulative schemer, but as his own flesh and blood, a reflection of his past mistakes, a mirror to his own soul. The crystal shards, sparkling cruelly on the polished floor, became symbolic of his shattered life, the fragments of a world he had built on lies and denial. Ethan placed a hand on his father's shoulder, a gesture at once comforting and accusatory. She's your daughter," he whispered, the words hanging in the air, heavy with implications. The unspoken question, the raw pain in Zara's departure, hung between them, a chasm of regret. Arthur's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions finally crushing him. The opulent setting, once a source of pride, now mocked him with its silent judgment. The journey towards redemption had begun, a long and arduous path, but one that now felt both inescapable and necessary. The faint strains of the orchestra, trying to regain their composure, felt jarringly incongruous with the emotional turmoil engulfing the three of them. The night had exploded, leaving behind only the fragments of a shattered world and the daunting task of piecing it back together. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint, discordant strains of the orchestra attempting a tentative restart. Crystal shards, scattered like fallen stars across the polished floor, glittered cruelly under the ballroom's subdued lighting. Arthur's breath hitched, a ragged sound lost in the vastness of the room. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, crushing him beneath the burden of his prejudice. Ethan's hand, resting lightly on his father's shoulder, offered a fragile bridge between the chasm of their fractured relationship. The touch was both comforting and accusatory, a silent testament to the depth of his disappointment. He'd seen the raw, unadulterated shock on Zara's face, the flicker of hurt that quickly morphed into a controlled, dignified withdrawal. Arthur's gaze, usually sharp and calculating, was now clouded with shame. He looked at his son, seeing not just disappointment but a profound disillusionment. The son he'd always viewed as his heir, his legacy, now looked at him with the cold, clear eyes of a stranger. I didn't know," Arthur finally whispered, his voice raspy, betraying the tremor in his hands. The words felt inadequate, pathetic, insufficient to encompass the enormity of his actions. The opulent setting, once a symbol of his success, now mocked him with its silent judgment. Ethan's silence was more damning than any outburst. The years of his father's casual racism, his ingrained prejudices, had finally caught up with them. He defended Zara, fiercely and wholeheartedly, only to discover a truth that shattered his own carefully constructed worldview. He'd unwittingly harbored some of his father's prejudices himself. A tear escaped Ethan's eye, tracing a path down his cheek, leaving a glistening trail against the crisp starch of his shirt. The lily-scented air, once vibrant and intoxicating, now felt heavy, cloying, a suffocating reminder of the night's devastating revelations. He looked at his father, a mixture of sorrow and anger warring within him. Arthur flinched under Ethan's gaze, the weight of his legacy pressing down on him. The carefully constructed facade of his wealth and success began to crumble, revealing the fragile foundation built upon ignorance and prejudice. His carefully curated life, built on privilege, seemed to collapse around him, leaving behind a desolate wasteland of regret. The path to redemption, he realized, was long and arduous. But for the first time, he saw it not as a punishment, but as a necessary pilgrimage. The journey had begun, marked by the silent accusation in his son's eyes and the lingering absence of the woman he had so carelessly judged. The DNA results, printed on crisp white paper, felt heavier than lead in Arthur's trembling hand. The stark black lettering, announcing Zara's parentage, seemed to burn into his retinas. Silence, thick and suffocating, descended upon the opulent ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast long, distorted shadows, mirroring the fractured state of Arthur's world. Ethan, his face ashen, stared at the paper, his breath catching in his throat. The lilies, their sweet fragrance usually so intoxicating, now felt cloying, a suffocating reminder of the shattered illusions. Zara stood composed, a statue of quiet dignity amidst the storm. Her composure, however, was a fragile mask, barely concealing the tremor in her hands, the slight catch in her breath. She met Arthur's gaze, her eyes reflecting a mixture of disbelief and hurt, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. I, Arthur stammered, the words caught in his throat. Shame, raw and visceral, washed over him, a tidal wave of guilt threatening to drown him. His carefully constructed world, built on wealth and prejudice, crumbled before his eyes. The accusations, the insults, the blatant disregard for Zara's feelings, they all came back to haunt him with brutal clarity. Ethan looked from his father to Zara, his heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Betrayal warred with shock, love with disbelief. He defended Zara fiercely, only to discover a truth that shattered his carefully constructed worldview, a worldview tainted by his father's prejudices. He'd unknowingly carried some of that prejudice himself. Zara's voice, when she finally spoke, was low and steady, controlled, yet laced with a quiet intensity that cut through the suffocating silence. "So," she said, her gaze unwavering, "this changes everything, doesn't it?" Her voice held no accusation, only a quiet statement of fact, a stark recognition of the devastating reality. The unspoken question hung in the air: what would Arthur do now? How would he face the consequences of his actions? The weight of that question pressed down on them all, heavy and inescapable. The opulent ballroom, once a symbol of celebration, now felt like a tomb, the silence echoing with the unspoken pain. The scent of lilies seemed to thicken, clinging to the air like a shroud. Arthur retreated to his opulent suite, the plush carpets muffling the sound of his unsteady footsteps. The scent of expensive cigars, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. He sank onto the velvet chaise lounge, the softness offering no solace. His meticulously crafted world, built on wealth and prejudice, lay in ruins. The crisp DNA report felt like a brand, searing his conscience. He stared at his reflection in the polished mahogany surface of a nearby table, a stranger gazing back, a man ravaged by guilt and self-loathing. His usually impeccable composure was shattered, replaced by a trembling vulnerability. He buried his face in his hands, the silence punctuated only by the ragged gasps of his stifled sobs. The weight of his actions pressed down, crushing him under the burden of his own hypocrisy. Meanwhile, in the quiet solitude of a smaller sitting room, Ethan and Zara sat facing each other, an unspoken chasm separating them. The ornate furniture, usually a symbol of luxury, felt cold and unwelcoming. Ethan, his face etched with a mixture of shock and grief, finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry, he stammered, his eyes welling up. I never saw it. Zara looked at him, her expression a mixture of hurt and understanding. The initial shock had given way to a weary sadness. You didn't have to, she replied softly, her voice laced with a quiet dignity that belied her inner turmoil. It was his prejudice, not yours. Though, she added, a hint of bitterness coloring her words. Your silence spoke volumes. The silence hung heavy between them, thick with unspoken accusations and remorse. The lilies, their fragrance still heavy in the air, seemed to mock their sorrow. The opulent setting felt like a cruel irony, a stark contrast to the raw emotion that filled the room. Ethan reached for her hand, his touch tentative, uncertain. Zara didn't pull away. The simple gesture, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain and a tentative step towards forgiveness, felt more powerful than any words could express. The weight of Arthur's actions cast a long shadow, but in the quiet understanding between Ethan and Zara, a fragile hope began to bloom. The heavy oak door to Arthur's suite remained closed, a barrier mirroring the wall of denial within. The air hung thick with the scent of stale cigar smoke and regret. He paced, the polished floor reflecting his tormented face, his tailored suit suddenly feeling like a suffocating cage. The DNA report lay crumpled on a nearby table, a stark white testament to his shattered life. He hadn't touched the expensive cognac he'd poured, the amber liquid mocking his inability to swallow his bitter truth. A soft knock startled him. Hesitantly, he opened the door to find Zara. Her composure was remarkable, a fragile mask concealing the hurt in her eyes. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that both impressed and shamed him. I wanted to talk, she began, her voice soft but firm, each word carefully chosen. The opulent suite, normally a symbol of his power, now felt small, inadequate to contain the enormity of their shared truth. What's there to say? Arthur mumbled, his voice rough with unshed tears. The guilt clawed at him, a relentless beast tearing at his carefully constructed facade. There's a lot, Zara replied, her eyes unwavering. Your actions have consequences, Father. You judged me, insulted me, based on nothing but your prejudice. And Ethan, he was silent. He allowed it. Arthur flinched at the mention of his son. He'd hoped to shield Ethan from the fallout, but Zara's words exposed his failure to protect his son from his own ingrained biases. He's a good man, Arthur stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Zara stepped closer, her gaze piercing. He is, but he failed to stand up for me. His silence hurt, too. This isn't just about me, Father. It's about the pain you've inflicted on both of us, and the damage you've done to yourself. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Arthur stared at her, a raw mixture of shame and dawning understanding on his face. The weight of his prejudice, the years of ingrained bias, finally began to crush him under its weight. The opulent surroundings seemed to shrink, the vast space suddenly confining, suffocating him with the reality of his actions. He saw, for the first time, the deep wounds he had inflicted. The apology remained unspoken, but in his eyes, Zara saw the beginnings of remorse, the first crack in his formidable wall of denial. The silence stretched, a tangible thing, thick with the unspoken accusations hanging between father and daughter. The scent of lilies, once so celebratory, now felt cloying, heavy in the air, mirroring the weight of Arthur's guilt. He wanted to speak, to explain, to somehow undo the damage, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by shame. Zara's quiet strength was a stark contrast to his inner turmoil. He saw the hurt in her eyes, a pain he had inflicted, a wound he couldn't simply stitch up with an apology. He watched her, a woman he barely knew, yet who held a piece of his heart he hadn't realized existed. The expensive furnishings of his suite, usually a source of pride, now felt tawdry, inadequate in the face of the raw emotion filling the room. The crystal decanter, reflecting his haunted face, seemed to mock his self-imposed isolation. "Ethan," she whispered, breaking the silence, her voice laced with a weariness that pierced him. He flinched. His son. He had failed him too, by his silence, by his acceptance of his prejudiced views. "He loves you," Arthur croaked, the words rough against his parched throat. It wasn't a defense, but a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm between them, a testament to the dawning understanding of the depth of his mistakes. Zara's gaze softened fractionally. "I know," she said, a faint tremor in her voice, "and that makes it harder to see him complicit in your prejudice." The gentle accusation hung in the air, an unspoken judgment of his failure as a father. He looked down at his hands, gnarled and trembling slightly. The polished wood of his desk seemed to reflect not only his image, but the decay of his soul. The years of ingrained prejudice, of casual racism, now rose up to haunt him, their ugly heads twisting his gut. The weight of his legacy, of his actions, threatened to crush him. He started, the word caught in a sob. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, to plead for understanding, but the words failed him. He had built walls around his heart for so long, walls of privilege and prejudice, that he didn't know how to dismantle them. The silence returned, deeper this time, a profound acknowledgement of the gulf that separated them. But within that silence, within the crushing weight of his guilt, a tiny seed of hope began to take root. The road ahead was long and arduous, but he saw, finally, the first step toward redemption. The heavy silence in the opulent suite was broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock, each chime a hammer blow to Arthur's already shattered composure. He watched Zara, the woman he'd so recently scorned, now revealed as his daughter, a revelation that twisted his gut with a pain far sharper than any physical wound. The expensive Persian rug beneath his feet felt suddenly rough, alien under his trembling hands. He smelled the faint, lingering scent of lilies and champagne, a potent reminder of the wedding he'd so violently disrupted. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some semblance of an apology, but the words caught in his throat, choked by a lifetime of ingrained prejudice. He saw the flicker of something akin to pity in her eyes, a pity that stung more than any outright condemnation. I didn't know," he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. The words felt inadequate, pathetic in the face of the enormity of his actions. Zara's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "Knowing wouldn't have changed your behavior, would it, father?" The use of the word, father, hung heavy in the air, a fragile bridge across a chasm of hurt and betrayal. Her voice, though calm, held an undercurrent of quiet fury, a controlled anger that spoke volumes. He flinched. Her words were a mirror reflecting his own ugly truth. He judged her based on assumptions, on the ingrained biases he'd carried for far too long. He saw the pain in her eyes, a pain he himself had cultivated. The weight of his legacy pressed down on him, suffocating him with guilt. Ethan entered then, his face etched with a sorrow that mirrored Arthur's own turmoil. He moved towards Zara, his hand hovering near hers before retracting, unsure of what to say. He looked at his father, his gaze a mixture of disappointment and a flicker of something resembling forgiveness. "Dad," Ethan said softly, his voice trembling slightly, I didn't know either." His words were a fragile attempt at reconciliation, an acknowledgement of his own complicity in his father's prejudice. He had been silent, accepting, and now the guilt gnawed at him. Arthur looked from Zara to Ethan. The chasm between them seemed insurmountable. He had hurt them both, his arrogance and prejudice leaving deep wounds. He watched them, two people he'd wronged, and a wave of self-loathing washed over him, drowning him in the bitter truth of his actions. The opulent suite felt like a prison, its gilded cage trapping him in his own self-made hell. The lilies seemed to mock him, their sweet fragrance a bitter reminder of the day he'd shattered everything. The heavy silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Arthur, his face ashen, stared at the ornate Persian rug, its intricate pattern blurring through his unshed tears. The scent of lilies, once celebratory, now felt cloying, a sickeningly sweet reminder of his disastrous intrusion. He felt the weight of his actions pressing down, crushing him under the burden of his own prejudice. Ethan, his face pale, moved closer, his hand outstretched hesitantly towards Zara. The unspoken words hung heavy between them, a tangled web of guilt and confusion. He watched his father, a lifetime of unquestioned respect crumbling around him, replaced by a dawning understanding of his own complicity. Zara, however, remained motionless, her posture betraying nothing of the turmoil within. The quiet strength she'd displayed earlier was now tinged with a weary exhaustion. Her eyes, though dry, held a depth of hurt that pierced Arthur to the core. The opulent surroundings, once symbols of happiness and promise, felt cold and empty. The glittering chandeliers seemed to mock him with their careless brilliance. I need to speak to you alone, Zara," Arthur rasped, his voice a mere shadow of its usual booming confidence. The words felt strange and unfamiliar on his tongue. He felt a tremor run through him, a physical manifestation of his inner turmoil. Zara looked at Ethan, a silent exchange passing between them. There was understanding, a shared burden of the wreckage Arthur had caused. Then, with a slow, deliberate nod, she followed Arthur into a smaller sitting room, the heavy drapes muting the brightness from the main suite. The air here was thick with the scent of old leather and polished wood, a stark contrast to the flowery opulence of the main ballroom. The silence in this room was different, more intimate, more charged with unspoken accusations. Arthur sank into an armchair, the plush velvet offering little comfort. He watched Zara, his daughter, the woman he had so cruelly judged, and a fresh wave of shame washed over him. He picked up a crystal glass, its weight cold against his trembling hand. The ice clinked softly, a small, fragile sound in the vastness of his regret. "I don't know where to begin," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. He watched, waiting, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. The weight of his unspoken apology pressed upon him, heavier than any physical burden. The small sitting room, dimly lit by a single lamp, felt suffocating. The scent of old leather and polished wood, usually comforting, now felt oppressive. Arthur watched Zara, his daughter, the woman he'd so readily condemned, her face an impassive mask. He saw the faintest tremor in her hand, a subtle betrayal of the turmoil beneath her composure. The silence stretched, a heavy, tangible thing. I don't know what to say," Arthur finally managed, his voice a low, ragged whisper. The words caught in his throat, the weight of his prejudice pressing down on him with crushing force. He felt the sting of unshed tears behind his eyes, a burning humiliation that intensified with every passing second. Zara remained silent, her gaze fixed on the ornate Persian rug, mirroring his own earlier fixation. The intricate pattern seemed to mock him, a symbol of the complexity he'd so carelessly ignored. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps a sliver of understanding. A flicker of hope ignited within him, fragile yet potent. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and strained. I was wrong, terribly, unforgivably wrong. The confession tasted bitter on his tongue. He watched her closely, searching her face for any sign of judgment. He saw only a deep weariness, a profound sadness. Your accusations, Zara finally spoke, her voice soft but firm, were not just hurtful, they were devastating. They stripped me of my dignity, my joy, my future. Each word was carefully chosen, precise and deliberate. She didn't raise her voice, yet her words held the weight of 1,000 unspoken accusations. Arthur flinched, the words striking him like tiny, sharp stones. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the floor, shame burning in his chest. I know, and I can't undo it. I can only try to make amends. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, almost fearful. She didn't pull away. He saw a tear trace a path down her cheek, a tear he felt mirrored in his own soul. The silence returned, but this time it felt different, lighter, infused with a fragile, nascent hope. The weight of his past actions still pressed upon him, but now, a glimmer of something new was taking root. A seed of remorse, a beginning of reconciliation. The path ahead remained long and arduous, but for the first time, Arthur felt a flicker of true, unadulterated hope. The next morning, sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through the sheer curtains of Arthur's hotel suite. The opulent room, usually a symbol of his success, felt cold and empty. He lay in bed, the crisp sheets doing little to soothe the turmoil within him. The weight of his actions pressed down, a physical burden. He replayed Zara's words, each syllable a sharp, accusatory stone. Devastating, stripped me of my dignity. He winced, the memory causing a fresh wave of shame. He got up, the movement slow and deliberate, his body aching with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. The bathroom mirror reflected a stranger, a man etched with regret, his eyes shadowed and haunted. He splashed cold water on his face, the shock momentarily clearing the fog in his mind. He needed to see Zara again, to apologize properly, to begin the arduous task of making amends. He found her in the hotel lobby, sitting alone, a cup of untouched tea steaming beside her. The elegant suit she wore couldn't mask the vulnerability in her posture. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded. The silence that settled between them was thick with unspoken emotions. Zara, he began, his voice a low murmur. I wanted to apologize again, from the bottom of my heart. He searched her eyes, desperate for some sign of forgiveness, but found only a quiet sadness. Your apologies, she said, her voice barely a whisper, feel hollow, considering the depth of your prejudice. She paused, taking a deep breath. My fiancé. Her voice cracked slightly. He's heartbroken, and I am too. Not just by your words, but by the realization that you are my father. A single tear rolled down her cheek. Arthur's heart clenched. He reached out, his hand trembling as he gently touched her arm. I understand, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I can only hope, with time, that you'll believe my remorse is genuine. I never knew. I was blind to my own actions. Blind to you. The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the nearby cafe, a stark contrast to the heavy silence hanging between them. He saw a flicker of something different in her eyes, not forgiveness, not yet, but a tentative softening. A tiny seed of hope, fragile but tenacious, began to take root in the barren landscape of his guilt. The path to reconciliation was long, filled with obstacles and uncertainty, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild not only his relationship with his daughter, but his own fractured self. The hotel suite felt suffocating. Arthur paced, the plush carpet a muted whisper under his feet. The scent of lilies, usually a comforting indulgence, now felt cloying, a stark reminder of the wedding he'd crashed, the life he'd disrupted. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the movement a desperate attempt to calm the storm raging within him. Guilt gnawed at him, a relentless beast. He hadn't just insulted Zara. He denied her happiness, her dignity, and for what? Blind, hateful prejudice. He picked up the discarded DNA report, the stark black print mocking him. The evidence was undeniable. Zara, the woman he'd scorned, the woman he'd accused of scheming, was his daughter, his own flesh and blood. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless and unsteady. He sank onto the chaise lounge, the silk sinking beneath his weight, offering no comfort. Ethan's call came as a jarring interruption. Arthur's son's voice, usually filled with youthful optimism, was strained, laced with a weary sadness. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice barely a whisper. I don't understand. I feel like I've been living a lie." Arthur listened, the silence punctuated only by Ethan's choked words, each one a sharp jab at his conscience. He learned of Ethan's own struggle, his silent acceptance of his father's prejudiced views, the seed of doubt that had begun to grow within him as he'd witnessed his father's cruelty firsthand. Arthur's heart ached for his son, for the unspoken pain they both carried. The conversation ended with a heavy silence, the unspoken weight of their shared guilt hanging in the air. Arthur hung up, feeling profoundly alone in the opulent emptiness of his suite. The city lights, twinkling in the distance, seemed to mock his isolation. He was a wealthy businessman, a man accustomed to power and control, yet he felt utterly powerless, lost in a maze of his own making. He needed to atone. He needed to reach out, not just to Zara, but to the fractured parts of himself he'd hidden for so long. The path ahead was daunting, but he had to start somewhere. The cold reality was that the damage done couldn't be undone, but maybe, just maybe, it could be repaired. The faintest glimmer of hope pierced the darkness. The morning light, pale and hesitant, filtered through the heavy drapes of Arthur's hotel suite. The opulent room, usually a sanctuary of comfort, felt like a gilded cage. He hadn't slept, the weight of his revelation pressing down on him like a physical burden. The discarded DNA report lay on the floor, a stark testament to his folly. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the crisp lines of the medical jargon, each word a painful reminder of his prejudice. A soft knock on the door startled him. He called out a curt, "Enter," his voice raspy from disuse. Ethan stood in the doorway, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored Arthur's own. He carried 2 steaming mugs, the aroma of strong coffee cutting through the heavy silence. "I brought coffee," Ethan said quietly, his eyes avoiding his father's. He placed the mugs on the table, the clink of ceramic a small, sharp sound in the quiet room. Arthur nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He picked up his mug, the warmth a small comfort against the icy grip of guilt. He took a long sip, the bitter liquid doing little to soothe the turmoil within him. I'm sorry, Dad," Ethan began, his voice breaking. I didn't understand. I believed everything you said about Zara. I was prejudiced too." Arthur's gaze softened. His son's confession was a mirror reflecting his own failings. He saw the pain in Ethan's eyes, the weight of his own unspoken prejudices. The revelation wasn't just about Zara. It was about a lifetime of ingrained biases, of unspoken judgments. He reached across the table, his hand covering Ethan's. "I know, son," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been a fool, a blind, hateful fool." He squeezed Ethan's hand, the simple gesture carrying the weight of unspoken apologies and regrets. He knew the road to reconciliation wouldn't be easy, but the first step, the admission of guilt, was a start. He looked at his son, seeing the hurt reflected there, but also a nascent understanding. The path to forgiveness was long and arduous, but it was a path they would begin walking together. The coffee grew cold, forgotten, as father and son began the long process of mending their broken relationship. The journey towards reconciliation had begun. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the plush carpet of Arthur's study. Dust motes danced in the golden light, a silent ballet mirroring the turmoil within him. He sat heavily in his leather armchair, the expensive leather offering little comfort. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. He picked up a framed photo of a younger Zara, a vibrant, laughing child with eyes that mirrored his own. The resemblance was undeniable, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed image of a gold digger he'd built in his mind. Guilt gnawed at him, a bitter, relentless ache. He heard a soft knock. "Come in," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. Zara entered, her composure as serene as ever, but the slight tremor in her hand betrayed a hidden vulnerability. The years of carefully cultivated poise couldn't completely mask the hurt in her eyes. "I wanted to talk," Zara began, her voice low and measured. The air thrummed with unspoken accusations, with years of prejudice and misunderstanding. She walked towards the window, gazing at the sprawling estate below. "Your actions, they hurt me deeply, more than words can say." Arthur watched her, his heart heavy with remorse. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him. He couldn't offer empty platitudes. He had to confront the truth, not just for Zara, but for himself. "I know," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I've acted terribly. My prejudice blinded me. I see that now." He looked at Zara, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a threat, but as his daughter, a woman who deserved his love and respect. A long silence hung between them, punctuated only by the distant chirp of a bird. Then Zara turned, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's not just the wedding, Father. It's everything." Her voice cracked, the years of silence and unspoken hurt finally breaking through. The weight of her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had not only hurt her, but he had caused irreparable damage to his relationship with his son. He had to do better. He had to start now. The scent of lilies, still clinging to the air from the aborted wedding, felt cloying now, a bitter reminder of Arthur's failure. He sat alone in his vast study, the silence broken only by the mournful ticking of the grandfather clock, each tick a hammer blow to his already shattered self-esteem. The afternoon sun, once a symbol of celebratory warmth, now cast long, accusing shadows across the room. He stared at the framed photo of young Zara, her laughter a ghost in the polished glass. The resemblance was painful, a constant visual reminder of his profound mistake. A soft knock. He didn't answer, lost in the labyrinth of his regret. The knock came again, gentler this time. "Come in," he finally rasped, his voice rough with disuse and remorse. Ethan entered, his shoulders slumped, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. The guilt etched on his son's face mirrored his own. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice low. He stopped, searching for the right words, his gaze flicking to the photo of Zara. I'm sorry. For everything." Arthur looked up, surprised by the apology. He'd expected anger, accusations, perhaps even contempt. He hadn't expected this shared burden of guilt. "I'm the one who should be apologizing, son. To both of you." He swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his remorse. "It wasn't just the wedding, Dad. It was everything. The way you talked about Zara. I believed it for a while. I let your prejudice influence me." Ethan's voice cracked, the confession heavy with shame. The weight of his son's words hit Arthur harder than any accusation. He'd not only hurt Zara, he'd poisoned his relationship with his own son. The thought was a fresh wound, raw and painful. He looked at Ethan, truly seeing him, not just as a son, but as a man wrestling with his own internal conflicts. "I know, son. I failed you both. I let my prejudice, my arrogance, blind me to the truth." He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands, gnarled and trembling. "I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." The words were a promise, a plea for forgiveness, a pledge to a new beginning. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions, a shared acknowledgement of the pain and the long, difficult road ahead. The afternoon light deepened, the shadows lengthening, but in the shared silence, a glimmer of hope began to take root. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Arthur's trembling hands. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. He stared at the untouched whiskey, its amber glow mocking his inner turmoil. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. He hadn't slept properly in days. The image of Zara's hurt face seared into his memory. Ethan's words echoed in his ears. Asterisk. It wasn't just the wedding, Dad. It was everything. Asterisk. The weight of that statement pressed down on him, crushing him under the burden of his own prejudice. He'd not only damaged his relationship with Zara, but he'd also shattered the trust with his son. A quiet knock on the door. He hadn't the energy to speak, only a slight nod. Zara entered, her presence filling the room with a quiet dignity that both humbled and shamed him. She was dressed simply, her usual radiant beauty dimmed, but not extinguished, by a profound sadness. He saw the faint lines of weariness around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she clasped them together. "I wanted to talk," Zara said, her voice soft, but firm. The silence that followed hung heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and regret. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock, each tick a stark reminder of time lost, of opportunities missed. Arthur opened his mouth, then closed it again, the words catching in his throat. He reached for the whiskey, then stopped, ashamed of seeking solace in its bottom. "Zara," he began, his voice rough. "Your apology," she interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. "I heard it from Ethan, but I need to hear it from you." Her eyes, usually sparkling with laughter, held a deep well of hurt, a profound disappointment. Arthur stared at her, at the woman who was his daughter, his blood, the person he'd so carelessly judged and insulted. The resemblance was striking now, a painful mirror reflecting his own failings. The tears finally came, hot and unrestrained. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of his actions finally breaking him. "I am so sorry, Zara," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "So profoundly, irrevocably sorry." The ensuing silence was not heavy with accusation, but with shared grief, a recognition of pain endured and a nascent hope for healing. The setting sun cast a warm glow on the scene, a subtle promise of a new dawn. The following morning, sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through the opulent drapes of Arthur's study. The air hung heavy with the residue of his weeping, a damp chill clinging to the mahogany. He sat hunched over his desk, the untouched whiskey still beside him, a monument to his sleepless night. The silence, however, was different now. It wasn't the suffocating weight of guilt. It was the fragile calm before a possible storm. He picked up a framed photograph. Zara, a child with bright eyes and a mischievous grin, was nestled in the lap of a younger, less hardened version of himself. A woman's hand, blurred in the snapshot, rested gently on Zara's back. The ghost of a memory, a forgotten love, prickled at his conscience. A soft knock. He didn't need to ask who it was. Ethan entered, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored his own, but tempered with a cautious hope. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice low, "I spoke to Zara. She wants to see you, but..." He hesitated, his eyes searching Arthur's face. "But she needs assurances." Arthur nodded, his throat tight. "Assurances she won't be subjected to my ignorance again. I understand." He felt the tremor in his voice, the vulnerability that had been buried for so long. He looked at his son, seeing the years of unspoken disappointments, the hidden hurt. Ethan sat down, the silence stretching between them, fragile and precious. "It wasn't easy for her, Dad. Finding out you're her father, and that you judged her so harshly. The unspoken words hung in the air, and that you almost prevented her happiness." Arthur swallowed, the lump in his throat immense. "I'll face her, and I will make amends. I will show her, I will show both of you, the depth of my remorse." He looked at the photograph again, the ghost of his past love haunting him with its muted reminder of his profound failure. The weight of his prejudice, the cruel sting of his judgment, the gaping hole of his regret. It was a burden he had to carry, to atone for, to finally lay down at his daughter's feet. The sun, now climbing higher in the sky, cast a warmer glow on the room, a promise of healing, however tentative, however far off it might seem. The path ahead was long, but for the first time in days, Arthur felt a flicker of hope, a fragile tendril of a new beginning. The opulent hotel suite felt colder than the previous night. Arthur paced, the plush carpet muffling his restless steps, the scent of lilies from the abandoned wedding bouquet a cruel reminder. He'd spent the night battling demons, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of his actions. The whiskey remained untouched. The bitter taste of his regret was far more potent. Ethan's words echoed in his mind, asterisk, but she needs assurances, asterisk assurances. He stared at the photograph again, the young Zara radiating a joy he'd almost stolen. The blurred woman's hand, a phantom touch, a lost connection. He hadn't just hurt Zara. He'd betrayed a part of himself he'd buried deep, a tentative knock. He braced himself, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. Zara stood in the doorway, her composure a fragile shield masking the hurt he'd inflicted. Her eyes, usually sparkling with life, held a quiet sadness that pierced him. The sunlight caught the delicate silver chain around her neck, a gift from Ethan. "Father," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the formality a stark contrast to the warmth that might have been. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, with the weight of his prejudice hanging heavy between them. He opened his mouth, the words catching in his throat. He'd prepared a speech, a carefully crafted apology, but the words felt hollow, inadequate. He looked at his daughter, his long-lost daughter, and saw not the gold digger his prejudiced mind had concocted, but a woman of quiet strength, wounded but not broken. "Zara," he began, his voice rough with unshed tears. There is no excuse for my behavior. My actions were born from ignorance, from fear, from—" He struggled to find the words. "From a deep-seated prejudice I am ashamed to admit." Silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. The faint hum of the city outside felt miles away. Zara didn't interrupt, didn't offer comfort. She simply waited, her gaze steady, unwavering. The weight of his silence pressed down on him, heavier than any condemnation. He finally managed, I want to make amends." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, perhaps hope, perhaps a fragile willingness to forgive. The path to reconciliation was long and arduous. He knew, but for the first time, he saw a glimmer of light piercing the darkness of his regret. The hotel suite's opulent emptiness mocked Arthur's turmoil. Sunlight, a cruel spotlight, illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, each a tiny, mocking reminder of his wasted time. The scent of lilies, sharp and cloying, clung to the room like a shroud. He hadn't slept, the guilt a relentless tide eroding his carefully constructed composure. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture revealing the tremor in his hands. A soft knock. He braced himself, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He knew, without seeing her, that Zara's composure was a carefully constructed wall, shielding a heart he'd wounded. She entered, her silhouette framed by the doorway's light. The silver chain Ethan had given her glinted faintly, a painful reminder of his son's unwavering belief in her, a belief he, Arthur, had so callously dismissed. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, were shadowed with a quiet sadness that cut him to the core. "Father," she began, her voice a fragile whisper, the formality a stark contrast to the warmth he'd so cruelly extinguished. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint hum of the city outside, a constant, indifferent thrum against their shared desolation. He wanted to speak, to apologize, but the carefully rehearsed words crumbled in the face of her quiet dignity. He could only see the woman he had wronged, not the stereotype his prejudiced mind had created. He'd not only hurt Zara, he'd wounded a part of himself he'd buried so deep it had almost become a forgotten relic. "Zara," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. There is no excuse for my behavior. My actions stemmed from ignorance, fear, from a deep-seated prejudice I am ashamed to admit." He paused, the weight of his confession pressing down on him, heavier than any condemnation. She didn't interrupt. She simply waited, her gaze unwavering, a testament to her quiet strength. The silence hummed, a charged space filled with unspoken accusations and the weight of his prejudice. He needed to say more, to express the profound regret gnawing at his soul. He needed to somehow convey the devastation he felt, the profound shame that ate at him. He needed her to understand. The path to forgiveness felt impossibly long, yet in her steady gaze, he saw a flicker of something akin to hope, a fragile willingness to begin the arduous process of healing. He cleared his throat. I want to make amends." The hotel suite's muted elegance felt like a cage. Arthur paced, the plush carpet a silent witness to his turmoil. The faint scent of lilies, a constant, unwelcome reminder of the wedding he'd disrupted, clung to the air. He stopped, his reflection in the polished mahogany dresser a stranger, haggard, defeated. He hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, the weight of his actions crushing him. He heard Zara's voice, soft, measured, before he saw her. She stood in the doorway, a vision of controlled grace, yet the shadows beneath her eyes betrayed her pain. The silver chain Ethan had given her, a symbol of love he'd tried to destroy, caught the light. "Father," she said, the word formal, distant. The formality stung more than any accusation. He wanted to plead, to beg for forgiveness, but the words caught in his throat. The carefully constructed defenses he'd built crumbled before the quiet dignity in her eyes. He saw not a gold digger, as his prejudiced mind had painted her, but a woman deeply wounded by his actions. A woman who was unbelievably his daughter. "Zara," he began, his voice hoarse. I have no excuses. My behavior was born of ignorance, fear, a prejudice I am ashamed to admit." He paused, the confession heavy, suffocating. He watched her closely, searching for any sign of anger, of rejection. Her expression remained impassive, but a single tear traced a path down her cheek, breaking the carefully constructed dam of her composure. It was a tear of hurt, of betrayal, but also, perhaps, of a sorrow shared. A sorrow for the father she'd lost, and the relationship they might have had. "Your ignorance hurt me, father," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of unspoken accusations. "Your prejudice caused immense pain, not just to me, but to Ethan." The sting of her words was sharp, but he deserved it. He deserved far more. He had insulted her, questioned her integrity, driven a wedge between her and his son, all based on nothing but his own ingrained biases. The realization brought fresh waves of shame crashing over him. He watched her, this woman he judged so harshly, and saw a strength, a resilience he could only admire. A strength he hadn't recognized through his own blindness, through his own fear. The path to forgiveness was long, arduous, fraught with challenges, but in her quiet acceptance, he saw the first faint glimmer of hope. A hope, fragile yet tenacious, that maybe, just maybe, he could begin to make amends. The journey would be long, he knew, but he was ready to begin. The hotel suite, still redolent with the lingering scent of lilies, felt less like a cage and more like a confessional. Arthur sat opposite Zara, the mahogany table a stark barrier between them, yet somehow less imposing than the chasm of his own making. He watched her fingers trace the rim of her untouched teacup, the delicate porcelain a counterpoint to the tremor in her hand. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words and the weight of a lifetime of missed opportunities. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and unfamiliar. "Zara," he began again, his voice catching. "I know saying sorry isn't enough. It never will be." He looked away, the shame too profound to bear. He saw his reflection in the polished surface of the table, a man ravaged by regret, his usually sharp features softened by a grief that had settled deep in his bones. Zara met his gaze, her eyes, the color of warm honey, holding a sadness that mirrored his own. "It's a start, father," she said, her voice low and steady. The formality had eased slightly, replaced by a fragile hope. "But starting means acknowledging what you did. Not just the intrusion at the wedding, but the years of prejudice, of thinking you had the right to judge my life." He nodded, the admission burning in his throat. "I allowed my own fears and insecurities to dictate my actions. I saw only what I wanted to see, blinded by my own arrogance and prejudice. I judged you based on assumptions, on stereotypes, on the color of your skin, on your relationship with Ethan." A tremor ran through Zara's shoulders. "And you nearly destroyed my happiness," she said quietly, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You hurt Ethan, you hurt me, you hurt yourself. The man I saw at the wedding, that wasn't the man I know now. And I'm afraid that even now I don't know you at all." The honesty in her words struck him harder than any accusation. He saw the pain, the betrayal, the profound hurt she carried, and he felt the crushing weight of his responsibility. He had to make amends not just for the sake of their relationship, but for the sake of his own soul. He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. She didn't pull away. The simple gesture felt monumental, a silent pledge to begin the arduous journey towards reconciliation. The path ahead remained long and uncertain, fraught with the challenges of healing old wounds. But in that shared moment of vulnerability, a fragile seed of hope began to take root. The following morning, sunlight, pale and hesitant, filtered through the sheer curtains of Arthur's hotel suite. He woke to the lingering scent of lilies and the gnawing emptiness in his gut. The mahogany table, still bearing the remnants of their untouched tea, felt like a monument to his failure. He saw Zara's empty chair, a stark reminder of the chasm between them. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating. He needed to make amends not just for Zara, but for Ethan, for the man he'd failed to be. He found Ethan in the lobby, nursing a lukewarm coffee, his usual vibrancy dimmed. The sight of his son, usually brimming with life, now burdened by worry, struck a deeper chord of guilt. "Ethan," Arthur began, his voice a rough whisper, "can we talk?" Ethan's response was a slow, hesitant nod. They found a secluded corner, the hushed murmur of the hotel fading around them. Arthur, avoiding his son's gaze, confessed his fear of losing him, his fear that Zara might be one of them. A prejudiced thought he now loathed. The words tumbled out, raw and unfiltered, stained with regret. Ethan listened patiently, his initial anger replaced by a quiet sadness. He saw the genuine remorse in his father's eyes, the genuine pain. "I never meant to hurt you, son," Arthur finally said, his voice cracking. "I was a fool, blind, prejudiced." Ethan's hand rested briefly on his father's arm, a gesture of unexpected comfort. "It's not just Zara, Dad. You hurt yourself too. You lost years with her." He paused, his gaze drifting to the bustling lobby. "But there's still time to fix this." Later, Arthur found Zara by the hotel pool, the gentle lap of water against the stone a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil within him. He sat beside her, the distance between them shrinking. The sun warmed his face, but the chill of his past actions lingered. He spoke of his past, of the affair that led to Zara's birth, of the fear and guilt that had driven him to hide. He didn't expect forgiveness, just understanding. Zara listened, her gaze fixed on the shimmering water. When he finished, a tear traced a path down her cheek. "I understand, Father," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But understanding doesn't erase the hurt." He nodded, accepting the truth of her words. The path to forgiveness was long, arduous, filled with the need for continuous self-reflection and conscious effort. Yet, in that shared moment by the pool, under the warm sun, a fragile hope, akin to a delicate seedling pushing through hardened earth, began to bloom. The journey toward healing had begun. The hotel restaurant hummed with a low, polite buzz. Sunlight streamed through the expansive windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Arthur, stiff in his tailored suit, felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. He sipped his lukewarm coffee, the bitterness mirroring the taste in his mouth. Zara, across from him, radiated a quiet strength that both intimidated and humbled him. The air between them crackled with unspoken apologies and fragile hope. I don't know what to say, Zara," he began, his voice raspy. He avoided her gaze, focusing on the swirling cream in his coffee cup. The delicate china felt cold against his trembling fingers. Zara's eyes, dark and luminous, held a mixture of sadness and weariness. "You don't have to say anything, Father," she replied softly, her voice calm but laced with a tremor of emotion. "But your actions, they spoke volumes." The quiet dignity in her voice cut him deeper than any accusation could have. He swallowed, the lump in his throat constricting his breath. "My prejudice, it was monstrous. I let my fear, my ignorance, blind me." He finally met her gaze, seeing the pain reflected back at him. The intensity of it was almost unbearable. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the clinking of cutlery and the murmur of other diners. He watched her meticulously trace the rim of her teacup, her fingers moving with a delicate grace that belied the turmoil within her. "Ethan told me about your past," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "About the circumstances of my birth. About your fear." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Fear is a powerful thing, Father, but it shouldn't dictate our lives." He nodded slowly, tears stinging his eyes. The weight of his years of denial and prejudice threatened to crush him. He saw now, with terrifying clarity, the damage he had inflicted, not only on her, but on Ethan and on himself. The realization was a searing brand, permanently etching itself onto his soul. "I want to make amends," he finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to be a part of your life, Zara. A father, not a stranger." He reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly as it hovered over hers. Zara didn't pull away. Instead, she gently covered his hand with hers, her touch unexpectedly warm and reassuring. "The road to forgiveness," she said, her voice soft, "is a long one, but I'm willing to walk it with you, Father, if you're truly willing to change." The unspoken hope in her words, like a tender shoot pushing through the frozen ground, offered a promise of a future he'd almost destroyed. The faintest hint of a smile played on her lips, a glimmer of light piercing through the darkness. The following days were a blur of carefully chosen words and hesitant gestures. Arthur, haunted by Zara's quiet dignity, retreated to his opulent but now sterile-feeling penthouse. The city lights, usually a symbol of his success, felt cold and distant. He found himself staring at old photographs, each one a painful reminder of his past mistakes. He saw a young Zara in his arms, a tiny, helpless infant. His heart ached with a grief so profound it nearly consumed him. Ethan, meanwhile, navigated the turbulent waters of his own emotions. He'd witnessed his father's transformation, the slow, agonizing shedding of his prejudice, and felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. He found solace in Zara's unwavering strength, her quiet acceptance a testament to her resilience. One evening, a gentle rain fell, washing over the city in a cleansing cascade. Arthur, driven by a newfound sense of purpose, found himself at Zara's doorstep. He carried a simple bouquet of lilies, their white petals mirroring the fragile hope blooming within him. The apartment was bathed in the soft glow of lamplight, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere. Zara sat by the window, her profile illuminated by the rain-streaked glass. The silence between them was thick with unspoken emotion. "Zara," he began, his voice thick with emotion, I came to apologize, not just for that day, but for all the years before." He placed the lilies on a nearby table, their fragrance filling the room. He watched her, his heart pounding in his chest. The years of emotional repression began to crack, revealing a vulnerability he hadn't known he possessed. Zara turned, her eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight. There was a trace of sadness, but also a flicker of something akin to understanding. "I know you're trying, Father," she replied softly, "but forgiveness isn't something that's given freely. It's earned." He nodded, understanding. He had much to earn. He spent the next few hours recounting his life, his regrets echoing in the quiet apartment. He confessed his past mistakes, his selfish actions, the pain he'd caused. He spoke of his ignorance, his fear, his deep-seated prejudices, and how the revelation of Zara as his daughter had shattered his carefully constructed world. He confessed to the deliberate avoidance of acknowledging his past relationship, explaining his fear of the judgment of his social circle. He cried, a man undone by the weight of his past and the sudden clarity of his present. Zara listened patiently, offering only occasional words of quiet encouragement, her empathy and forgiveness beginning to thaw the walls of his bitterness. The rain continued to fall outside, a soothing rhythm to their painful reconciliation. By the time the first rays of dawn peeked through the curtains, a tentative understanding had begun to bloom between them, a fragile hope for a future built not on prejudice, but on forgiveness and love. The dawn light, pale and hesitant, filtered through the sheer curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the quiet apartment. Arthur sat stiffly on the edge of a plush armchair, his tailored suit rumpled, his usually impeccable hair disheveled. The scent of lilies, a stark contrast to the lingering tension, hung heavy in the air. Zara, a silhouette against the window, stirred, a sigh escaping her lips. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the clean, sharp smell of petrichor. "It's difficult," Zara began, her voice soft, barely a whisper against the silence. She turned, her eyes, dark and luminous, meeting his gaze. "To forgive someone who denied your very existence for so long." She wasn't accusing, not exactly. There was a weariness in her tone, a profound sadness that tugged at Arthur's heart. He swallowed, the lump in his throat thick with unshed tears. "I understand. I don't expect forgiveness. Not yet, anyway. But I need you to know, I am truly sorry. More than words can ever express." His voice cracked, revealing the vulnerability he'd so carefully concealed for years. He saw a flicker of something akin to compassion in her eyes, a tiny crack in the ice wall she'd erected around her heart. He continued, his voice gaining strength. "I wasn't just prejudiced against your race. I was prejudiced against everything that wasn't like me, against anything that challenged my carefully constructed world." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing his inner turmoil. "I hid you away, Zara. I denied you, and in doing so, I denied a part of myself." Zara moved closer, her steps slow and measured, like someone walking on fragile glass. She sat on the arm of the chair, her hand resting lightly on his. The touch was electric, a jolt of connection that transcended years of estrangement and pain. "I never understood," she said, her voice barely audible, "why you did what you did, why you reacted the way you did at the wedding." "Fear?" Arthur breathed, the word escaping him like a sigh of relief. "Fear of losing my position, my reputation. Fear of what people would think." It was a pathetic excuse, I know. He squeezed her hand gently, the contact offering a small measure of comfort. "But the fear of losing you, that's a new kind of fear, and it's far more terrifying." Silence descended once more, a heavy blanket of unspoken words and buried emotions. The rising sun cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the fragile hope that was beginning to blossom between them. a fragile flower pushing its way through the hardened ground of years of neglect and prejudice. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile belief in the possibility of redemption. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy between them, a tangible thing in the quiet apartment. Sunlight, now stronger, painted stripes across the polished wooden floor. Arthur watched Zara, her hands still resting on his, a fragile connection bridging the chasm of years. He saw the faintest hint of a smile play on her lips, a hesitant bloom in the desert of her pain. "My business, it suffered," he confessed, his voice a low rumble. The admission surprised him. It was a vulnerability he hadn't anticipated. The scandal, it spread like wildfire. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble against his skin. The image of his carefully constructed world crumbling was a painful one. Zara nodded, understanding etched onto her face. "I heard whispers," she said softly. "But it doesn't matter now. What matters is us." The word hung between them, fragile and hopeful, a tentative bridge across the ravaged landscape of his actions. That afternoon, Ethan arrived, carrying a bouquet of sunflowers, their bright faces a stark contrast to the somber mood that had lingered. He moved cautiously, sensing the delicate balance between his father and Zara. He saw the slight softening in his father's demeanor, a tremor in the rigid posture that had been so ingrained for so long. He saw the guarded hope in Zara's eyes. I wanted to apologize," Ethan began, his voice thick with emotion, "for my own prejudices, for the way I internalized your ideas, Dad." He looked at Zara, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'm sorry for any pain I caused." The air crackled with unspoken words, a symphony of regret and tentative forgiveness. Arthur looked at his son, a lump forming in his throat. He'd never considered the impact of his actions on Ethan, the insidious way his prejudices had seeped into his son's heart. He'd been so focused on his own self-preservation, he hadn't realized the damage he inflicted on those he claimed to love. Later that evening, they sat together on the balcony, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. Zara, for the first time since the wedding, seemed at peace, her shoulders relaxed, her smile genuine. The rain had washed away the grime of the past, leaving behind the promise of a new dawn. Arthur felt a surge of gratitude, of hope he hadn't dared to allow himself before. He realized that forgiveness wasn't a quick fix, but a slow, deliberate process, a journey of self-reflection and constant effort. It wasn't just about Zara's forgiveness. It was about his own self-forgiveness, about learning to forgive himself for the man he had been. The path ahead was still arduous, but for the first time in a very long time, he felt a flicker of hope, a belief in a future where he could finally make amends and build a different kind of life, one built on acceptance, not prejudice. The family wasn't healed, not yet, but they were together, facing the sunrise together. The smell of the petrichor lingered, a sweet fragrance of renewal and new beginnings. The following week, Arthur sat at his mahogany desk, the city sprawling beneath him like a toy town. The once gleaming edifice of his success now felt tarnished, the weight of his actions pressing down. He picked up a framed photo of Zara, a radiant smile captured before his intrusion. Guilt gnawed at him. He'd lost more than a business deal. He'd lost his daughter. A soft knock. Zara entered, her gaze steady, though her eyes held a quiet sadness. The sunlight, streaming through the window, illuminated the faint bruising under her eyes, a testament to sleepless nights. He stood, his usual imperious posture softened. I wanted to talk," Arthur began, his voice raspy, the words caught in his throat. Zara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I received your apology," she said, her words measured, careful. "But apologies aren't enough. Actions speak louder than words, Father." He understood. He'd built his life on words, on power, on carefully constructed facades. His actions had shattered those facades, leaving a raw, vulnerable core exposed. "I know," he murmured, his gaze fixed on her face. "I've already begun restructuring my company. I've donated to several charities supporting interracial causes. It's a start. A flicker of something akin to hope crossed Zara's face. It was faint, fragile, easily extinguished. He saw it and his heart clenched. This wasn't about fixing his reputation. It was about earning her forgiveness, rebuilding a broken relationship. "And what about your prejudices, Arthur?" she challenged gently, her voice rising slightly. "Can you truly say you've addressed those? Or is this just damage control?" The question cut deeper than any accusation. He looked away, the city lights blurring through the window. I'm working on it. Every day. It's a long process," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't expect you to forgive me instantly, but I want you to know, I'm trying." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers before gently resting on it. Her hand didn't pull away. It was a small victory, a crack in the wall of her pain. The silence that followed felt heavier than the city beneath them. But it was a different kind of silence, filled not with anger, but with the uneasy hope of reconciliation. The path ahead was still long, but they were walking it, together. The following weeks were a blur of strained silences and hesitant attempts at connection. Arthur, stripped bare of his usual arrogance, found himself adrift in a sea of self-doubt. His opulent penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded cage. The city lights, usually a source of pride, now mocked his failure. He'd lost more than a business deal. He'd lost his daughter, his son's unwavering respect, and a piece of his soul. One evening, he found himself in his study, the mahogany desk cluttered with legal papers and half-finished sketches for a new charity initiative, a foundation dedicated to bridging racial divides, a stark contrast to his past. The scent of old leather and aged paper hung heavy in the air. He picked up a worn photograph of a younger Zara, laughing, her eyes bright with mischief. A sharp pang of regret pierced him. He judged her based on the color of her skin, oblivious to the vibrant soul beneath. Ethan entered, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored his father's. He carried a steaming mug, the aroma of chamomile tea filling the room, a subtle balm to their fractured relationship. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice soft. "Zara, she wants to talk." Arthur nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He felt the weight of his actions, the profound damage he had inflicted. He felt the crushing weight of his own prejudices. He had to try, for Zara, for Ethan, for himself. The meeting was arranged in a small, quiet cafe, the gentle murmur of conversations a low hum in the background. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and pastries mingled with the scent of rain outside. Zara arrived, her composure as striking as it was heartbreaking. Her eyes, though still bearing the marks of her hurt, held a flicker of cautious hope. The conversation was halting, punctuated by long silences filled with unspoken emotions. Arthur, stripped of his usual bravado, confessed his guilt, his remorse, and his earnest desire for reconciliation. He spoke of his attempts to atone, not just financially, but through genuine self-reflection. Zara listened, her expression unreadable, her responses measured and thoughtful. She spoke of the pain he'd caused, the insidious nature of his prejudice, and the long road ahead. Yet, there was a quiet strength in her voice, a resilient spirit that hinted at forgiveness. As the rain intensified outside, casting long shadows across the cafe, a tentative understanding began to bloom. It wasn't a sudden blossoming of reconciliation, but the fragile beginning of healing. The city outside raged, but inside, in the quiet corner of the cafe, a new chapter, uncertain yet hopeful, began to unfold. The path was arduous, but father and daughter were walking it, together, one hesitant step at a time. The following weeks were a blur of carefully chosen words and averted gazes. Arthur, humbled and stripped of his arrogance, felt the weight of his actions press down on him. His sprawling penthouse, once a sanctuary of success, felt like a gilded prison. The city's glittering skyline, usually a source of immense pride, now mocked his failures. He'd lost far more than a business deal. He'd forfeited his daughter's trust, his son's respect, and a significant piece of his soul. One crisp autumn evening, the scent of wood smoke drifting in from the open window, he sat in his study, surrounded by legal documents and the half-finished sketches for a new charity, a foundation dedicated to racial reconciliation, a stark contrast to his past. He picked up a faded photograph of a younger Zara, her laughter captured in a candid shot. A sharp pang of regret, raw and visceral, pierced him. He had judged her based solely on the color of her skin, blind to the radiant spirit within. A soft knock interrupted his contemplation. Ethan entered, his face etched with a weariness that mirrored his father's. He carried 2 steaming mugs, the calming aroma of chamomile tea a balm to their fractured relationship. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice low. "Zara, she's agreed to meet." Arthur nodded, a lump forming in his throat. The meeting was arranged at a small cafe, sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries mingled with the scent of rain outside. Zara arrived, her composure a mask over the hurt he'd inflicted. Her eyes, though still bearing the weight of pain, held a fragile spark of hope. The conversation was halting, punctuated by long, pregnant silences. Arthur, devoid of his usual bravado, confessed his guilt, his profound remorse, and his desperate desire for reconciliation. He spoke of his attempts at atonement, not just financially, but through genuine self-reflection and a commitment to change. Zara listened, her expression unreadable, her responses measured and thoughtful. She spoke of the deep wounds he had inflicted, the insidious nature of his prejudice, and the arduous journey toward healing. Yet, an unwavering strength resonated in her voice, a quiet resilience hinting at the possibility of forgiveness. As the rain intensified outside, a tentative understanding began to bloom, fragile yet persistent. It wasn't a sudden reconciliation, but the delicate beginning of healing, a slow, painstaking process. The city raged outside, but inside, in the quiet corner of the cafe, a new chapter, uncertain but hopeful, was unfolding. The cafe, a haven of warmth against the November chill, hummed with the low murmur of conversations. Rain lashed against the windows, a relentless rhythm mirroring the turmoil in Arthur's heart. Zara sat opposite him, her posture elegant, yet her hands clasped tightly in her lap betrayed her inner tension. The scent of cinnamon and coffee hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of regret that filled Arthur's mouth. He cleared his throat, the sound oddly loud in the quiet space. "Zara," he began, his voice a low rumble, I can't express the depth of my shame." He hesitated, searching for the right words that could possibly undo the damage he'd inflicted. Zara met his gaze, her eyes, the color of dark chocolate, reflecting the storm outside. "Actions speak louder than words, Father," she said, her voice calm but laced with a quiet steel. "Your actions have caused irreparable damage." He flinched. He knew she was right. His words, however sincere, couldn't erase the pain, the hurt, the years of ingrained prejudice he'd unleashed. The weight of his past, of his arrogance and ignorance, pressed down on him, suffocating him. Ethan, seated nearby, watched them, his heart aching for both of them. He understood Zara's pain. He felt his own guilt for the prejudices he'd unknowingly harbored. The aroma of chamomile tea, a small comfort, did little to ease his anxiety. Arthur leaned forward, his voice thick with emotion. "I've started a foundation, Zara, dedicated to racial reconciliation. It's a small step, but it's a start." He pushed a brochure across the table, his hand trembling slightly. Zara picked it up, her fingers tracing the embossed logo. Silence settled between them, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain. Finally, she looked up, her expression unreadable. "It's a start," she echoed softly, her voice barely a whisper. "But the journey is long." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a tear of sorrow, perhaps, but also one of tentative hope. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, with the weight of a lifetime of misunderstandings, with the fragile possibility of healing. The rain outside intensified, yet inside, in that small cafe, a delicate seed of forgiveness had been sown. The following weeks were a blur of strained silences and awkward attempts at connection. Arthur's sprawling mansion, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a gilded cage. The weight of his actions hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the humidity of a summer storm. He found himself drawn to the quiet solitude of his study, the polished mahogany desk a cold comfort against the tempest in his soul. He reread Zara's letter, a crisp, elegant script on thick cream paper, its words both wounding and unexpectedly forgiving. One evening, the scent of lilies, Zara's favorite, drifted from the hallway. Hesitantly, Arthur followed the fragrance, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He found her in the conservatory, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun filtering through the stained glass windows. The air hummed with the gentle buzz of bees, a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. "Zara," he began, his voice a raspy whisper, barely audible above the gentle rustle of leaves. She turned, her gaze calm, yet her eyes held a depth of sadness that pierced him. The lilies, vibrant and fragrant, seemed to mock his clumsy attempts at reconciliation. "Father," she responded, her voice soft but firm. "I appreciate the gesture, the foundation, but words are cheap. Show me, not tell me." He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his guilt. "I understand," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. I will dedicate my life to making amends." He didn't offer platitudes or empty promises. Instead, he began to talk about his past, about the choices that shaped him, the prejudices that blinded him. He spoke of his shame, his regret, the deep well of self-loathing that threatened to consume him. He spoke of Ethan, of his blind, almost cruel defense of his own ingrained biases. Zara listened patiently, her expression unreadable, but the subtle softening of her posture hinted at a gradual shift within her. The setting sun cast long shadows across the conservatory, painting the scene in shades of orange and purple. The air, once heavy with tension, began to lighten. A shared silence settled between them, a silence filled not with animosity, but with the fragile possibility of healing. In that shared silence, in the shared breath of the setting sun, a father and daughter, once estranged, began to find their way back to each other. The journey was long, the scars deep, but a single, fragile bloom of hope had taken root. The following weeks were a slow, deliberate dance of reconciliation. Arthur, once the picture of imperious control, found himself humbled, his meticulously crafted world crumbling around him. The scent of lilies, Zara's favorite, became a constant, bittersweet reminder of his failings. He initiated a series of small gestures, a donation to Zara's favorite charity, anonymously at first, then with a quietly attached note. Tiny pebbles tossed into the vast chasm of his self-inflicted hurt. One crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur found Zara in the garden, tending to a newly planted rose bush. The air, sharp with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, held a poignant beauty. He stood at the edge of the manicured lawn, watching her, a fragile observer in his own life's unfolding drama. Her movements were deliberate, each action precise, mirroring the careful reconstruction of their relationship. "Beautiful," he murmured, finally breaking the silence. Zara looked up, her expression guarded. "They're climbing roses. My grandmother used to grow them." Her voice, though calm, carried a tremor of unshed tears. Arthur approached cautiously, his footsteps hesitant on the gravel path. "Your grandmother," he repeated, the name a bridge to a past he'd ignored for too long. He spoke of his own mother, a woman he'd barely known, a woman whose absence had shaped him in ways he'd only just begun to understand. He spoke of regret, of the missed opportunities, the prejudice that had blinded him. He spoke until the words, raw and filled with the weight of his unspoken guilt, flowed freely. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the garden in hues of amber and deep crimson. The roses, still unfurling their delicate buds, seemed to witness the quiet unfolding of a father's confession. Zara didn't interrupt. She simply listened, her gaze fixed on the burgeoning roses, as if searching for a metaphor for their fragile, growing connection. When he fell silent, exhausted by the outpouring of his emotions, a single tear traced a path down her cheek. "It's a start, Father," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. "A very small start, but a start nonetheless." The tentative acceptance in her voice was a balm to his wounded soul. He knelt beside her, his hands calloused and rough against the soft earth around the rose bush. He didn't expect forgiveness, not yet, but the seed of hope, planted in the fertile ground of shared sorrow, was finally beginning to sprout. The long road to reconciliation was far from over, but in the quiet beauty of the autumn garden, a father and daughter, wounded but not broken, began to heal. The following weeks were a blur of awkward silences and hesitant smiles. Arthur, usually impeccably dressed, often looked rumpled, his expensive suits unable to conceal the weight of his guilt. He'd withdrawn from his usual social circles, the glittering parties and exclusive dinners replaced by quiet evenings at home, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Ethan, observing his father's transformation, felt a strange mixture of relief and pity. He'd never known his father to be so vulnerable. One evening, finding Arthur alone in his study, surrounded by unopened mail and half-empty glasses of scotch, Ethan approached cautiously. The air hung heavy with the scent of old leather and regret. "Dad," Ethan began, his voice low. I'm sorry." Arthur looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. He managed a weak smile. "For what, son?" "For being a monumental fool." Ethan shook his head. "For not seeing, for not understanding, for letting my own prejudices blind me." A long silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling fireplace. Then Arthur spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Zara, she's stronger than I ever imagined. More forgiving, too." He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his hand trembling slightly. "I don't deserve her forgiveness, but I hope one day, I hope she'll find it in her heart." Ethan nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He saw the flicker of genuine remorse in his father's gaze, a glimmer of hope amidst the ruins of his father's self-destruction. The path to redemption was long, arduous, and filled with uncertainty, but for the first time, Ethan saw a possibility of genuine reconciliation, a chance for a healthier, more honest relationship with both his father and Zara. The future was unwritten, but the seed of forgiveness, planted in the fertile ground of shared sorrow and self-awareness, had finally begun to sprout. The scent of lilies, once a symbol of his father's misguided actions, now held the faintest promise of a future filled with the fragrance of forgiveness and reconciliation. The mahogany table in Arthur's study felt cold beneath Zara's fingertips. The air, thick with the scent of aging leather and pipe tobacco, held the residue of his apologies, still raw and hesitant. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns. Inside, the silence hummed with unspoken words. I never meant to cause you pain," Arthur began, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock. His gaze, usually sharp and calculating, was soft, almost pleading. He looked older, etched with lines of remorse that hadn't been there just weeks ago. Zara met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting a complex tapestry of hurt and hesitant understanding. The lilies he'd sent, a pathetic attempt at reconciliation, lay wilting in a vase nearby, their once vibrant fragrance now faint and melancholic. "Your actions spoke louder than your words, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "The hurt runs deep." He nodded, a single, slow movement that spoke volumes. "I know, and I understand if you can't forgive me, but I need you to know, I'm trying to be better." He ran a hand through his thinning silver hair, a gesture of weariness and self-reproach. The weight of his actions seemed to physically bend him. "Trying isn't enough," Ethan interjected, his voice gentle yet resolute. He stood by the fireplace, a silent observer, a mediator between the fractured pieces of his family. "You have to show us, Dad. Actions, not words." Arthur looked at his son, a flicker of hope igniting in his eyes. The years of distance, of unspoken resentments, felt momentarily less insurmountable. "I understand, Ethan. I'll dedicate myself to rebuilding your trust, Zara's, and proving I've changed." A silence fell, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions, of past mistakes and the tentative steps towards a future yet to be written. The flickering firelight danced on their faces, illuminating the profound shift in their dynamic. The lilies, though dying, symbolized a fragile promise of rebirth, of a family slowly, painstakingly, piecing itself back together. The path ahead was uncertain, but in that quiet room, amidst the scent of regret and the faintest whisper of hope, the first seeds of forgiveness had begun to take root. The following weeks were a blur of awkward silences and hesitant gestures. Arthur, usually the picture of controlled authority, seemed perpetually on the verge of tears. His once impeccable suits hung loosely on his frame, mirroring the fragility of his carefully constructed persona. He attended family dinners, a stark contrast to his previous absence, picking at his food, his eyes often fixed on Zara, a mixture of guilt and longing in their depths. The opulent Blackwood mansion, once a symbol of his power, felt strangely oppressive, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock, a relentless reminder of time slipping away. One evening, Zara found him in the conservatory, surrounded by the fragrant blooms he'd always adored. He sat hunched over, sketching in a worn leather-bound journal, his usually sharp features softened by the mellow light filtering through the glass roof. The scent of jasmine and roses mingled with the faint smell of his pipe tobacco, a familiar yet bittersweet aroma. "It's beautiful," Zara said softly, approaching him cautiously. He looked up, startled, his eyes filling with a sudden welling of tears. I never knew," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never knew you existed. And the way I treated you." He trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of his regret. Zara sat beside him, the cool stone bench a comforting contrast to the warmth of the conservatory. "It's all right, Father," she said, her voice gentle. The word felt strange, yet strangely comforting. "I understand, but understanding doesn't erase the pain." He nodded slowly, tracing the delicate lines of a rose with his pen. "No, it doesn't, and I can't expect you to forgive me easily. But I want to try, to make amends. Not just with you, but with Ethan, with myself." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. The years of hardened prejudice had fallen away, revealing a man grappling with the consequences of his actions. A man finally seeing the depth of his mistakes. A man finally ready to try. The lilies, he thought, a silent symbol of his failed attempt at reconciliation, were nothing compared to this genuine plea. The fragile promise of rebirth felt a little less fragile now. The following weeks were a tentative dance, a slow waltz of apologies and hesitant forgiveness. Arthur, usually a whirlwind of activity, moved with a deliberate slowness, each step measured, weighted by the burden of his past actions. He traded his sharp suits for softer fabrics, his tailored shirts for comfortable sweaters. The change wasn't just sartorial, it reflected a softening within. One afternoon, Zara found him in the library, surrounded by towering bookshelves and the scent of aged paper and leather. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light. He sat hunched over a worn photograph album, his fingers tracing the image of a younger Zara, a child with bright, inquisitive eyes. I used to think," he began, his voice rough with unshed tears, "that I was protecting Ethan from you, from everything." He looked up, his gaze meeting Zara's. The old arrogance was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that both surprised and moved her. Zara moved closer, the silence punctuated only by the soft rustle of the turning pages. "I know," she whispered, her voice low and steady. "But you were wrong, father. Terribly wrong." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the photograph again. "I know, and the worst part is that I hurt Ethan too. He loved you, despite everything I said and did." A deep sigh escaped his lips, a sound heavy with regret. He always saw the best in people. Unlike me. He closed the album, the snap a small, sharp sound in the quiet room. He looked up at Zara, his eyes filled with a raw honesty she'd never seen before. "I want to make amends," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For both of you." A tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. Zara reached out, her hand gently covering his. "It will take time, father," she said softly, her voice laced with a hint of understanding. "But I'm willing to give you that time." He squeezed her hand, a silent promise passing between them, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of his past mistakes. The air in the library seemed to lighten, the weight of his guilt, if not entirely gone, considerably lessened. The journey was long, but for the first time, Arthur felt a flicker of genuine hope. The path to forgiveness was paved with small steps, but the first tentative steps had been taken. The following months unfolded like a delicate tapestry, woven with threads of apology, understanding, and tentative joy. Arthur, once a man defined by sharp angles and power suits, now favored softer lines, his movements less forceful, more deliberate. The imposing figure had softened, his presence less a storm, more a gentle breeze. He took up painting, surprisingly adept with oils, capturing the vibrant hues of the Tuscan landscape that had always been a backdrop to his opulent life, but now held a deeper meaning. Each stroke seemed to be a brush against the canvas of his past, a slow erasure of harsh lines and prejudices. One evening, the family gathered on the sprawling veranda overlooking the ocean. The salty air, scented with jasmine and the distant tang of wood smoke, hung heavy with the promise of a new beginning. Zara, radiant in a simple sundress, laughed, a genuine, joyous sound that echoed Arthur's own hesitant mirth. Ethan, watching them both, felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. The weight of his father's prejudice, the hurt it had caused, seemed to lift with each shared smile. "Remember that dreadful day?" Zara teased, her eyes twinkling. The memory, once a source of pain, now held a bittersweet quality. Arthur chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "I'll never forget it. The most humiliating and enlightening day of my life." He paused, his gaze softening as he looked at Zara. "I owe you both a great deal." Ethan nodded, a warmth spreading through him. "It's a new chapter, Dad. For all of us." He raised his glass, a simple gesture laden with meaning. To forgiveness, to second chances, and to family. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. It was the sound of healing, the gentle rhythm of a life rebuilt on a foundation of understanding. The scars remained, subtle reminders of the past, but they were fading, replaced by the vibrant colors of a future painted with love, acceptance, and the quiet promise of a family finally whole. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and crimson, a breathtaking finale to a day of newfound peace. As darkness descended, the family remained, their bonds strengthened, their hearts lighter, their future uncertain yet bright with the promise of a dawn that held no more shadows of prejudice, only the warmth of a rediscovered love. The Tuscan sun, a molten orb sinking towards the horizon, cast long shadows across the sprawling villa. Inside, the air hummed with a quiet contentment, a stark contrast to the tempestuous events of the past months. Arthur, surprisingly relaxed in a worn armchair, watched Zara sketch in a large leather-bound book. The vibrant strokes of her charcoal mirrored the renewed vibrancy in her life. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his voice raspy with emotion. He'd never been one for sentimental gestures, but the sight of his daughter, so alive and vibrant, filled him with a profound sense of relief. Zara looked up, her eyes, the same shade of warm brown as his, held a hint of sadness, but mostly a deep well of forgiveness. "It's just a landscape, Papa," she replied softly, her voice carrying the gentle lilt of her Italian heritage. "But it reflects how I feel. Peaceful." The unspoken words hung between them, heavier than the Tuscan air, thick with the scent of blooming jasmine. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the comfortable quiet of shared understanding, a testament to their journey from bitter confrontation to fragile reconciliation. Ethan entered, a steaming mug in his hand. He smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. "Hot chocolate? Anyone? It's getting chilly." The warmth in his tone was palpable, a reflection of the peace that had settled over their family. Arthur accepted the mug, the warmth spreading through his hands, a comforting counterpoint to the lingering chill in his heart. He glanced at his son, then at Zara, a wave of emotion washing over him, regret, gratitude, and a deep, abiding love. He cleared his throat. "Ethan," he began, his voice thick with emotion, I'm sorry." The apology wasn't a grand gesture, but it held the weight of a lifetime of unspoken regrets. Ethan placed a comforting hand on his father's shoulder. "It's okay, Dad," he said softly. "We're moving forward." Zara nodded in agreement. "We are," she confirmed, closing her sketchbook with a soft click. "A new chapter begins tonight, under a beautiful Tuscan sky." The unspoken understanding hung in the air, a promise of a future where prejudice had no place and love and forgiveness were the guiding stars. The warmth of the fire, the comforting smell of hot chocolate, and the shared silence cemented a new reality, a family bound together not by blood alone, but by the enduring power of love's resilience. The following weeks unfolded in a gentle rhythm of healing. Arthur, surprisingly, threw himself into charitable work, his vast resources now channeled towards organizations supporting interracial families. He traded his tailored suits for more comfortable clothes, his stiff demeanor softening into a tentative warmth. The Tuscan villa, once a stage for his prejudiced outburst, became a sanctuary of quiet reconciliation. One evening, under a sky dusted with 1,000,000 stars, Arthur found Zara by the pool, her fingers tracing patterns on the rippling water. The scent of night-blooming jasmine hung heavy in the air, a sweet perfume mirroring the delicate progress of their relationship. "Zara," he began, his voice hesitant, I've been thinking a lot about what happened." Zara looked up, her gaze steady. "I know, Papa. I can't undo the past, but I can try to make amends, to be a better father." His voice cracked, the weight of his past actions evident in the tremor. He watched as Zara rose, walking towards him, the moonlight catching the silver streaks in her hair. "I know you are trying," she said softly, her hand resting lightly on his arm, the gesture surprisingly tender. "It takes time, but I see the change." Ethan joined them, his presence a silent reassurance. They fell into a comfortable silence, the sounds of crickets chirping their nightly serenade. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, regret, forgiveness, hope. Later, as the three sat on the veranda, the sound of waves lapping against the shore a soothing counterpoint to their quiet conversation, a genuine smile finally settled on Arthur's face. It wasn't the forced smile of societal obligation, but a smile that reached his eyes, reflecting a soul finding peace. He looked at Ethan and Zara, their intertwined hands a symbol of their enduring love, a love that had survived his prejudice and emerged stronger. He raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice filled with a depth of emotion he hadn't known he possessed. Ethan and Zara echoed his toast, their glasses clinking softly, the sound like a tiny chime marking the beginning of their new, healthier family. The Tuscan sky, a vast canvas of stars, witnessed their silent pledge, a promise of a future built on love, forgiveness, and the unwavering strength of family. The Tuscan sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. Inside the villa, a quiet hum of contentment replaced the earlier storm. Zara, nestled on a plush sofa, hummed a soft melody, the faint scent of lavender from her perfume mingling with the wood smoke from the fireplace. Ethan sat beside her, his arm casually draped around her shoulders, a comforting weight against her. Arthur, observing them from across the room, felt a pang of something akin to joy. It was a fragile feeling, easily shattered, but it was there nonetheless. He approached them, a half-formed apology trembling on his lips. He cleared his throat, the sound oddly loud in the peaceful atmosphere. "Zara," he began, his voice rough with emotion. I want to apologize again, properly this time. Not just for the wedding, but for all the years of..." He trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of his regret. Zara looked up, her eyes, the color of warm honey, reflecting the firelight. A small smile played on her lips. "Papa," she said, her voice soft yet firm, "your actions have consequences. They hurt, but seeing you truly change, that means something." Ethan squeezed her shoulder gently, his gaze meeting Arthur's. "It takes courage, Dad," he said, his voice filled with a surprising understanding. "To admit you were wrong, to confront your prejudices. That's a bigger step than most people ever take." Arthur's eyes welled up. He'd spent a lifetime building walls around his heart, walls fortified by prejudice and fueled by fear. Now those walls were crumbling, revealing a raw, vulnerable core. He swallowed, the lump in his throat making speech difficult. He looked at his son, then at Zara, their combined love a beacon in the growing darkness. He raised a hand, a hesitant gesture of affection. "Thank you," he whispered, the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime. He then looked at Zara, her beauty striking even in the soft light. "I hope one day you'll truly see me as your father." Silence fell between them, a comfortable silence filled with unspoken forgiveness and the promise of a future slowly being rebuilt, brick by painstaking brick. The crackling fire, the gentle music, and the unspoken understanding created a tapestry of peace. The Tuscan night whispered its approval, a soft breeze carrying the scent of jasmine and hope. The wounds remained, scars on their souls, yet the path to healing had begun. The following weeks unfolded in a delicate dance of reconciliation. Arthur, surprisingly, immersed himself in community outreach programs, his efforts clumsy at first, then increasingly genuine. The weight of his past prejudices seemed to physically lessen, his shoulders less hunched, his gait more confident. He even started attending Zara's art exhibitions, his critiques surprisingly insightful, though delivered with a newfound humility. One crisp autumn afternoon, Zara found him in the garden of the villa, tending to the roses, a stark contrast to the man who'd once stormed into her wedding. He wore a worn gardening apron, his hands gently pruning a rose bush. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in warm hues. "Papa," Zara said softly, approaching him. He turned, his eyes, usually sharp and calculating, now held a gentle warmth. "Zara, how are you, my love?" His voice was softer than she remembered. She smiled, a small, hesitant smile that mirrored the fragile beauty of the roses. "I'm better. Thank you for trying." He looked up at her, his gaze searching, vulnerable. "It's not enough, I know, but I'll keep trying. Every day." He picked a perfectly formed crimson rose, offering it to her. "For you." Zara accepted the rose, its velvety petals cool against her fingertips. The scent was intoxicating, a sweet reminder of life's beauty, of forgiveness and new beginnings. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was filled with unspoken understanding, the quiet hum of healing. Ethan joined them a few moments later, a steaming mug in his hand, the aroma of spiced cider filling the air. He offered Zara a warm smile, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey. The three of them stood together, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. A new family, imperfect yet undeniably bound by love, forgiveness, and a shared commitment to a brighter future, proving that even the deepest wounds can mend, given time and genuine effort. The crimson rose, a silent symbol of their newfound peace, held the promise of a future blooming with hope. The following months were a tapestry woven with threads of apology and acceptance. Arthur, once a man defined by sharp suits and sharper words, now found solace in the quiet rhythm of his sprawling garden. The scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine replaced the heady aroma of expensive cigars. He'd even taken up painting, his canvases a riot of vibrant colors, a stark contrast to the muted tones of his former life. His strokes, once as precise as his business dealings, now held a hesitant vulnerability. One evening, a soft rain fell, washing the city clean. Inside the warm, softly lit villa, Zara sat at the grand piano, her fingers dancing across the ivory keys. A melancholic melody filled the room, a testament to the emotional journey she'd endured. Ethan entered, carrying a steaming mug of chamomile tea. "That's beautiful, Zara," he whispered, settling beside her. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, finally free from the shadow of her father's prejudice. "Thank you, Ethan. It's cathartic. We've all come a long way," he said softly, his hand briefly resting on hers. His gaze drifted to the framed photograph on the mantelpiece, a picture of a younger Arthur, his face etched with a weariness Zara had only recently understood. A few weeks later, they celebrated Ethan and Zara's rescheduled wedding, a small, intimate affair, devoid of the ostentation that had marked the first attempt. Arthur, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, walked Zara down the aisle, his hand trembling slightly as he gave her away. The ceremony was simple, yet deeply moving, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the enduring strength of love. The crimson rose, a symbol of their shared journey, was woven into Zara's bridal bouquet. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Arthur stood alone on the balcony, a glass of wine in his hand. He looked out at the shimmering city lights, a profound sense of peace settling over him. The weight of his past mistakes still lingered, a subtle ache in his soul, but it was no longer crushing. He'd started to truly understand the devastating impact of his prejudices, and had begun the long, arduous work of rebuilding his life and his relationships, one painstaking step at a time. The future remained uncertain, yet it held a promise of hope, of healing, and of a love that had weathered the storm. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung heavy in the air, a comforting contrast to the lingering tension. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Arthur's redesigned study, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Gone were the stark, minimalist lines of his former office. Now, warm wood and comfortable armchairs created a space that felt less like a boardroom and more like a sanctuary. He sat at his desk, a half-finished painting before him, a vibrant landscape, far removed from the corporate charts that once dominated his life. The brush lay discarded, the colors still wet on the canvas. He picked it up, hesitant, then dipped it into a rich crimson, the same crimson rose that had adorned Zara's wedding bouquet. The soft chime of a phone interrupted his thoughts. It was Ethan. "Dad." Ethan's voice was laced with a cautious optimism. "Zara and we were wondering if you'd join us for dinner tonight?" Arthur's heart warmed. He felt a lump in his throat, the familiar sting of regret momentarily overwhelming him. "Yes, son," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I'd like that very much." The evening unfolded with a gentle grace. Laughter filled the spacious dining room, a melody that had been absent for far too long. Zara's smile, once shadowed by hurt, now radiated a quiet joy. Ethan watched them both, a subtle relief etched on his face. He saw his father, not as the cold, judgmental man of the past, but as a man grappling with his past, seeking redemption. As the evening drew to a close, Arthur watched Zara and Ethan leave, their hands clasped together, their silhouettes framed by the soft glow of the porch light. A wave of peace washed over him, replacing the relentless anxiety that had been his constant companion. He had a long way to go, he knew, but he was finally on a path towards healing. The crimson rose, a symbol of his journey, bloomed anew in his heart. Weeks later, the sprawling gardens of Arthur's estate buzzed with activity. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and freshly turned earth. Zara, her laughter echoing amongst the rustling leaves, helped Ethan plant a young sapling, a crimson rose bush, a deliberate choice. The sun warmed their faces, a stark contrast to the icy chill that had once permeated their world. Arthur watched from the veranda, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. The scene was a tableau of peace, a far cry from the turmoil he'd unleashed. He'd spent the intervening weeks immersed in therapy, confronting his prejudices, not just intellectually, but viscerally. The weight of his past actions still pressed upon him, but it was no longer a crushing burden. Ethan, noticing his father's gaze, offered a reassuring smile. "It's nice," Arthur finally managed, his voice rough. Ethan approached, a gentle hand on his father's shoulder. "It's a new beginning, Dad. For all of us." Later that evening, Arthur sat with Zara, the crackling fire casting dancing shadows on the walls of his newly redesigned study. He'd replaced the cold, impersonal furniture with pieces that spoke of warmth and family. He picked up a framed photo, a blurry snapshot of a young Zara, her eyes bright with mischief. A pang of regret, sharp and sudden, pierced him. I never knew," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been there." Zara, her gaze soft and understanding, met his. "It's not too late," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "You're here now." He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, yet filled with a genuine remorse. The years of distance, of prejudice and misunderstanding, seemed to melt away in that simple gesture. He saw not just a woman, but a daughter, a lost piece of his heart. "I've started making amends," he continued, his voice stronger now, "with the charity, with my business practices." Zara nodded, squeezing his hand. "Takes courage, Dad, and I see it in you." The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken words, with a shared understanding that transcended the hurt of the past. The crimson rose bush, a symbol of their fragile yet blossoming reconciliation, stood as a silent witness to their new beginnings, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the enduring strength of family. The future was uncertain, yet, for the first time in a long time, it held the promise of hope. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned windows of Arthur's study, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. The air, still carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the previous evening's fire, held a lightness it hadn't possessed before. Arthur, surprisingly rested, poured himself a cup of strong black coffee, the familiar ritual feeling different now, less a mindless habit, more a conscious act of grounding himself in this new reality. He watched Zara, her silhouette framed against the kitchen window, laughing as she shared a light moment with Ethan. The scene, once unthinkable, filled him with a profound sense of peace, a quiet joy that surprised him with its intensity. He joined them, the clink of his mug against the ceramic tiles a small, almost hesitant sound. Zara turned, her smile widening as she saw him. "Morning," she said, her voice warm. "Morning," he replied, the word feeling strangely foreign yet comforting. He looked at Ethan, who gave him a nod, a subtle acknowledgement of their shared journey. The unspoken understanding between them felt stronger than any spoken word. The breakfast table, normally a battleground of unspoken resentments, was now a haven of gentle conversation. They discussed plans for a family trip, a tentative idea, yet brimming with possibility. Arthur found himself actually enjoying the company of his son and daughter, a sentiment so new it felt almost surreal. The lingering shadow of his past prejudice still existed, a faint ache in his chest, but it no longer overshadowed the burgeoning joy and hope that bloomed between them. The crimson rose bush, a symbol of their shared journey, now held the promise of a future far brighter than he'd ever dared imagine. Later, as Arthur watched Zara and Ethan walking hand in hand across the manicured lawns, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The weight of his past mistakes was still there, a constant reminder of the harm he had caused. But the love he now witnessed, the nascent family unit he was finally part of, felt like a profound redemption, a second chance earned through honest self-reflection and profound remorse. It wasn't a complete erasure of the past, but a testament to the transformative power of forgiveness and the enduring strength of familial bonds. The future, though still uncertain, now held the promise of healing, of peace, and of a love that had miraculously blossomed from the ashes of his prejudice. Weeks later, the sprawling estate hummed with a different energy. Sunlight streamed through the newly installed conservatory, illuminating Zara's laughter as she taught Ethan's younger sister, Chloe, to paint water lilies. The scent of blooming jasmine mingled with the earthy aroma of freshly turned soil from Arthur's renewed commitment to the neglected gardens. The air, once thick with tension, now vibrated with a fragile peace. Arthur, watching from the doorway, felt a warmth spread through him, a feeling utterly foreign just months ago. He'd spent countless hours volunteering at a community center, a stark contrast to his previous self-absorbed existence. The weight of his past actions still pressed upon him, but it no longer suffocated him. "She's a natural," he murmured, surprising himself with the tenderness in his voice. Ethan, noticing his father's presence, smiled. "Chloe takes after Zara," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "A talent for finding beauty in unexpected places." His gaze lingered on Zara, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey, the love that had blossomed amidst the wreckage of his father's prejudice. That evening, Arthur found Zara in the library, carefully arranging photographs in a newly purchased album. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Beautiful," he said softly, gesturing towards the pictures. Many showed him, awkwardly but genuinely, interacting with his grandchildren. Zara looked up, her eyes, once filled with hurt, now held a quiet understanding. "It's a new chapter," she replied, her voice soft. "And a beautiful one, even with the scars." He nodded, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. The crimson rose bush outside, vibrant and strong, seemed a fitting symbol of their shared journey. He knew the past couldn't be erased, but it no longer defined them. They had built a foundation, brick by painstaking brick, on the rubble of his prejudice. The future, while uncertain, held the promise of healing, of a family bound not by blood alone but by forgiveness and a tentative, yet profound love. The air hummed, not with tension, but with the quiet promise of a new beginning. The following morning, a gentle rain softened the landscape, mirroring the quiet calm that had settled over the sprawling estate. Arthur, sipping his tea on the veranda, watched Zara tending the rose bushes, the same crimson roses that had witnessed so much turmoil. The scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine filled the air. He'd spent the previous evening painstakingly restoring an antique clock, a small act of atonement, a quiet gesture towards mending the fractured pieces of his past. He saw Ethan emerge from the house, a sketchbook in his hand, his usual pensive expression softened by a gentle smile. He joined Zara, and they fell into easy conversation, their laughter echoing softly against the backdrop of the falling rain. The sight filled Arthur with a bittersweet ache, a recognition of the love he'd almost destroyed and the joy he'd almost forfeited. Later that day, Arthur found Zara in the library, surrounded by old family photographs. He approached hesitantly. I found these in the attic," he stammered, holding out a worn box. "Old photos of my family before." His voice trailed off. Zara took the box gently, her fingers tracing the faded edges of a photograph showing a young Arthur, his eyes bright with a youthful energy he'd long since buried under layers of bitterness and prejudice. A silent understanding passed between them. "It's a lot to process," Zara said softly, her voice barely a whisper, but carrying the weight of unspoken forgiveness. "All of it," Arthur nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I know," he replied, his voice thick with regret. "I've spent a lifetime avoiding the truth, avoiding the pain, avoiding you." He paused, searching for the right words. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool." Zara met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the rain-washed sky. "And you've paid the price," she said, a trace of sadness in her voice, yet a hint of peace as well. "But I also see the change in you, Arthur. It is real." A faint smile touched her lips. "The future isn't defined by the past, but by what we choose to build from the rubble." He looked at her, truly saw her, and felt a surge of love and gratitude so profound it almost overwhelmed him. The rain had stopped. Sunlight filtered through the library window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. A fragile peace settling upon them. A promise of a new beginning, still fragile, but undeniably real. The crimson roses outside, vibrant and strong, stood as silent witnesses to their journey. Weeks later, the sprawling estate hummed with a newfound energy. Sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a stark contrast to the shadowed tension of weeks past. Zara, radiant in a simple sundress, laughed as Ethan sketched her by the fountain, capturing the effortless grace of her movements. The crimson roses, once witnesses to bitter confrontation, now bloomed vibrantly, their scent mingling with the sweet perfume of honeysuckle. Arthur watched them from the veranda, a half-finished chess game abandoned on the table beside him. The lines etched around his eyes had softened, replaced by a gentler weariness, a quiet contentment. He wasn't sure he deserved this peace, this unexpected family, but he wasn't about to squander it. That evening, a family dinner felt less like a forced reconciliation and more like a genuine gathering. The air thrummed with easy conversation, punctuated by laughter and shared memories. Ethan, his face flushed with wine, recounted a funny anecdote from his childhood, a story Arthur had never known. Zara's eyes, sparkling with mirth, glanced at Arthur, a silent acknowledgement of their shared past, their present healing. "Father," Ethan said, his voice low, I'm sorry for my part in all of this. I never considered your prejudices might stem from something so deep." Arthur reached across the table, his hand covering Ethan's. "I am too, son. I was blind to my own flaws, to my own pain, and to the love that was right in front of me." His voice cracked slightly, a testament to his vulnerability, to his profound regret. Zara, her hand resting on Ethan's, smiled faintly. "The past can't be erased, but it doesn't define us, does it?" Her voice was soft, but her gaze was unwavering, conveying a message of strength and acceptance. Arthur nodded, his eyes filled with a profound understanding. The weight of his past mistakes hadn't vanished, but they were lighter, carried with a newfound awareness, a growing sense of hope. He looked at his son, at his daughter, and felt a swell of love so strong it threatened to overflow. The crimson roses outside stood as silent testament to their journey. A journey of prejudice, revelation, and ultimately, the enduring power of forgiveness and family. The future remained unwritten, but for the first time, it felt full of promise. The following weeks were a blur of apologies, hushed conversations, and tentative smiles. Arthur, surprisingly, embraced therapy, his sessions punctuated by fits of frustrated anger followed by tearful confessions. The weight of his prejudice, once a shield, now felt like a crushing burden. He pored over old photo albums, tracing the faded image of a young Zara, a ghost of the daughter he'd lost, the woman he'd so cruelly judged. The scent of old photographs, a blend of paper and time, stirred a poignant ache in his chest. One crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur found Zara in the greenhouse, her fingers gently tracing the delicate veins of a climbing rose. The scent of damp earth and blooming flowers hung heavy in the air. He cleared his throat, the sound surprisingly loud in the quiet space. "Zara," he began, his voice husky. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. I wanted to apologize again, for everything." Zara turned, her eyes mirroring the soft light filtering through the glass panes. There was no anger in them, only a quiet sadness. "I understand, Father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But understanding doesn't erase the hurt." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the earth. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could try to make amends. He could try to be the father she deserved. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft purple, they sat together on the veranda, the gentle hum of crickets their only company. Ethan joined them, a silent observer, his presence a comforting reassurance. The air hummed with an unspoken understanding, a quiet peace that had been so long absent. The once bitter silence was now filled with a tentative, hopeful quietude. The past was still there, a shadow lingering at the edges, but the light of the setting sun illuminated a future that, for the first time, felt truly possible. The following Christmas, the family gathered not in the sterile opulence of Arthur's mansion, but in the cozy warmth of Zara's childhood home, a small cottage nestled beside a babbling brook. The scent of pine needles and gingerbread filled the air, a stark contrast to the icy formality of previous holidays. Arthur, his face etched with a newfound humility, watched Zara laugh, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she recounted a childhood memory. The sound was a balm to his soul, a melody he'd almost lost forever. Ethan, observing from the periphery, felt a surge of joy. He'd initially struggled with the revelation, the uncomfortable realization of his own unconscious prejudices mirrored in his father's blatant bigotry. But witnessing his father's genuine remorse and Zara's quiet forgiveness had been a profound lesson in empathy and healing. He approached them, a warm smile gracing his lips. "Remember that awful Christmas sweater I made you, Zara?" Ethan teased, a lightness in his tone. Zara chuckled, a genuine, unburdened laugh. "How could I forget? It looked like a strangled peacock." Arthur, surprised by the ease of the conversation, joined in, a genuine chuckle escaping him. "I believe your artistic talent lies elsewhere, son." He watched them both, this loving couple, his son and daughter, united, and felt a wave of gratitude wash over him, a relief so profound it almost brought him to his knees. The lingering weight of his past actions still burdened him, a constant reminder of the pain he had caused. But in the warmth of this moment, surrounded by the familiar smells of home and the laughter of his loved ones, he found a glimmer of hope, a second chance at redemption. The sound of the brook, a gentle lullaby, seemed to whisper a promise of a brighter future. A future where prejudice held no sway, where love and forgiveness reigned supreme. He knew the road ahead was long, the scars of the past would remain. But in this moment, surrounded by his family, Arthur felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The fragile family unit, once fractured beyond repair, was slowly, tentatively, piecing itself back together, one shared smile, one tender moment at a time. Months later, the renovated wing of Arthur's mansion, once a symbol of his isolation, hummed with life. Sunlight streamed through the newly hung curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Zara, perched on a plush velvet armchair, laughed at something Ethan said, her laughter a melody that soothed the lingering ache in Arthur's heart. He watched them from the doorway, a half-finished sketch of Zara in his hand, his fingers tracing the lines of her smile. The sharp edges of his grief had softened, replaced by a tentative peace. "Dad?" Ethan said, breaking the spell. "Come join us. Zara's showing me her grandmother's recipe for gingerbread." Hesitantly, Arthur approached, the scent of warm spices and cinnamon welcoming him. The air felt lighter, less burdened by the ghosts of his past prejudices. Zara, sensing his hesitation, smiled warmly. "Come sit, Arthur. It's not as good as mine," she teased, her voice laced with a playful affection that surprised him. He sat beside her, the warmth of her presence surprisingly comforting. He'd spent a lifetime building walls, but in this moment, they were crumbling, replaced by a sense of belonging he'd never dared to imagine. Ethan, ever the peacemaker, began to recount a humorous anecdote from Zara's childhood, his voice full of the easy affection only genuine love could create. Arthur found himself chuckling, the sound unfamiliar, yet strangely liberating. The gingerbread, surprisingly, was delicious. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Arthur found himself alone in his study. The sketch of Zara lay on his desk, a testament to his journey, his transformation. He picked up his pen, beginning a new sketch, a portrait of his family, a scene he'd once deemed impossible, a future he'd almost destroyed, now unfolding before him with tender hope. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with regret, but filled with the quiet hum of forgiveness and the promise of a new beginning, one carefully drawn line at a time. The lingering pain was still there, a soft ache, a constant reminder of his past, but it was now accompanied by a brighter, stronger feeling hope, a hope born not from denial, but from acceptance, from the power of forgiveness, and the profound, unexpected love he found in the most unlikely of places. The following weeks unfolded in a gentle rhythm of healing. Arthur, surprisingly, found solace in his art, sketching Zara and Ethan, capturing the subtle shifts in their expressions, the quiet moments of shared laughter. The mansion, once a cold, imposing structure, felt warmer, the air less thick with unspoken resentments. One evening, a gentle rain kissed the window panes. Inside, a fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the three figures gathered around a chessboard. Zara, her fingers delicately moving a knight, smiled at Ethan's playful frustration. Arthur watched them, a quiet contentment settling in his heart. The tension that had once dominated their interactions had dissolved, replaced by a tentative, fragile peace. "Checkmate," Zara announced softly, her voice a warm whisper in the quiet room. Ethan chuckled, good-naturedly conceding defeat. He reached for Zara's hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture of unspoken affection. Arthur cleared his throat, a slight nervousness coloring his voice. I never learned to play chess properly," he admitted, the words hanging in the air. He felt a blush creep up his neck. The confession, small as it seemed, was a significant step, a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself before. Zara smiled, a warmth that reached his eyes. "Perhaps we can teach you," she offered, her voice gentle, understanding. There was no hint of judgment, only quiet acceptance. Ethan nodded, a comforting silence settling between them, a silence filled not with emptiness, but with the quiet hum of shared experiences, of mutual forgiveness. The rain continued to fall outside, a gentle lullaby against the backdrop of their newfound harmony. The past remained, a shadow lingering at the edges, but it no longer held them captive. They were free, moving towards a future carefully constructed on the foundations of forgiveness, love, and the unexpected beauty of a family rebuilt from the ashes of prejudice. The scent of rain and wood smoke, the gentle crackle of the fire, the soft murmur of their conversation. These were the new sounds of home, a home built not on stone and wealth, but on the far more resilient foundation of love. Arthur watched them. The tension that had once interactions had dissolved, replaced by a tentative, fragile peace. Zara announced softly, her voice a warm whisper. Ethan chuckled, good-naturedly conceding, reached for Zara's hand, their fingers intertwining in a gesture of unspoken affection. A slight nervousness coloring his voice. "I never learned to play chess properly," hanging in the air. He felt a blush creep up his neck. The confession, small as built from the ashes of prejudice. Profession, small as profession, small as